What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless Engineer, and I critically analyze apologists' claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Tonight, I'm here with Dr. Richard Carrier, and we're going to be reviewing a History for Atheists interview where Tim O'Neill talks to Dr. Bart Ehrman directly about claims made by mythicists, but more specifically about about Dr. Carrier's work. And so we are so we're going to be handling those. There's a few sections here that I want to cover, and issues that I had with the interview, and we've got at least 4 sections here to kind of cover. And but Rick, do you want to introduce yourself, tell people where they can find you and everything like that?
Yeah, sure. Richard Carrier, PhD. I got my PhD in ancient history from Columbia University, and I have 2 tracks in my life. I work in modern philosophy and in ancient intellectual history, so that includes philosophy, science, and religion, and consequently, a ton of work in counter-apologetics, so it crosses both philosophy and history in counter-apologetics. So I do a lot of that. So people who don't know already who I am and my stuff, if you go to richardcarrier.info, that's .info, so it's just my name, .info. That has everything. So it's got the About Me page. It's got, the books, the many books that I've written, of all different kinds, and the courses I teach, links to my social media, my blog, all of that stuff is there. My blog is useful if you want to get a deep dive or more information about something we talk about today, because you can go there, use the search engine on my blog, and find probably I've written about it. Whatever your question is, I've probably written about it before.
Yeah, and I am going to get Carrier's links down in the description if they're not already there. I think I may have missed getting your website in there, but I will have all of his links down below in the description if y'all are interested in reading some of those. Which I have to say, Rick, you do a lot of great long form content, and you can really gain a lot of information from reading them. I mean, just recently you had maybe a back and forth with somebody over using Bayes on right. Aristotle.
Yeah.
And, I think that those are priceless for, being a good demonstration of using Bayesian analysis and all this other stuff. So I highly suggest reading your blog.
Exactly how the reasoning works, how it applies to history, how it actually describes what historians are already doing. And all we're doing is being more careful in describing the logic underlying what they're doing. That article that I just put up today is useful for a number of things. I'm starting to grow weary of the sort of pseudo-intellectualism of internet culture, and so I make it about that, but also I'll go into it, use it as a tutorial to show you this is how Bayesian reasoning actually works, and using the example of Aristotle, so there shouldn't be any bias against it, except when someone's offended that Aristotle is more likely to exist than Jesus, then they suddenly get all worried about all the evidence for Aristotle and completely change all their arguments, where now they're arguing against evidence being relevant or having an effect, when normally they're trying to argue that it does have an effect when it's Jesus on the line. Anyway, so that happens, and I don't know if that will connect with today's stuff. I actually haven't seen this. I only saw a little tiny bit of it because there was a correction I made on my errata that sort of fixes some of the wording that I think tripped them up. Maybe we'll talk about that later, but that was the only thing that I've really looked at on this so far, and I've not seen the rest of it, so I have no idea what's coming. I wasn't really, actually, as I told you, I wasn't enthused about it at all. I was like, you know what? I've heard everything Bart Ehrman has ever said. He never says anything new. I've heard everything O'Neill says. He never says anything new. O'Neill is especially not a particularly honest operator. So it's really just, I'm done with dealing with anything that O'Neill does. So you can go on my blog and search his name and you'll find tons of exposés of the shit he's pulled. I wasn't excited about this, but there was demand, and so I've been brought on to do it. So here I am today. I'm not in the mood for whiskey tonight. I'm going to have some Portuguese red blend from Portugal.
Okay.
Yeah. So.
Oh, that's cool.
Little soft.
Is that a wine?
Yeah. Red.
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
Red wine. Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. I don't have my beer open yet, but I do have hold on, let me go ahead and get it. I don't drink. I try to stay away from like the craft beer stuff because it sits heavy on me. But it's Christmas season, so they got this really cool one from a local brewery called S'more the Merrier.
Oh dear.
It's a stout brewed with graham crackers, chocolate, and marshmallows. So I'm being festive.
Okay, fantastic. That sounds horrible, but okay.
It's actually
I'm not
not
a beer
bad.
guy, so yeah.
I typically like to drink whiskey, but I have to remain competent for the stream. But so we are going to go ahead and get into the clips that we're going to be covering tonight. I do want to let everybody know that I have updated the description with a link to the Ehrman historicity recap on Richard Carrier's site. So it'll both take you to the site where you can get a link to everything that he's talked about so far, but also you can get caught up on the Bart versus Carrier sort of debate.
That's been going on for 10 years. Yeah.
Yes.
And for people who don't know, what we're taking clips from is Tim O'Neill, who's a hated atheist YouTuber, did his last show as an interview of Bart Ehrman recently, like within the last few months, I guess. And that's what we're looking at and I guess Tim O'Neill's retiring from, I'm not sure what, the channel or whatever. Conversely, Ehrman's retiring from his professorship, but therefore is going to be in the public eye more because he has more time. And presumably he's going to do more work. I hope he does something interesting because I really loved forgery and counter forgery, and I wonder if he'll do something like that. Or maybe he'll do a proper book on the historicity of Jesus that actually correctly describes what our arguments are, which I've been asking for ages, right? I want this a good counter argument book so I could tell people here's the best book against, here's the best book for, and people can compare the arguments. I mean, I've been wanting that for 10 years. No one's provided it. Now Ehrman has the time. Maybe he will actually do it for real, or not. We'll see. I'm not hopeful. I don't like, he doesn't seem at all inclined to he even read the book. And he clearly didn't, because in this interview, like, he'd never seen the material that O'Neill asks him to look at, and they get all confused about what's in the book, even right there in real time while they're looking at it, apparently. So
he does address peer-reviewed historicity books. So like he's going to address that near the end. So you will kind of get your answer, I guess.
Yeah.
You won't like it, but you know.
Yeah, sure. We'll find it. We'll get
I do want to let everybody know before we get into it that any super chat $5 or above will get priority in any kind of questions or anything of that nature. I did put a poll in the chat right now did Jesus exist, just to get a sense of the room there. So please do answer that poll so that it'll get pushed out to the algorithm and everything. Keep commenting down below in the side chat. That really helps us get out to the wider YouTube ecosystem. Yeah, and give a bitch a like. That's right.
Yeah, and let's, if possible, if it works for you, if we could just answer the super chats as they come in or near enough to.
Yeah.
Rather than waiting to stack them up at the end, because I think sometimes they get lost. And
yeah. Well, we could definitely pause things and do super chats when they come in. So
yeah, cool.
We can do that. All right. So first clip is going to be this one that I've entitled Ehrman's Circle. So it's very obvious that the way that O'Neill decided to prepare for this final interview with Dr. Bart Ehrman was to watch our previous interview where we reviewed Ehrman's course on Did Jesus Exist? Or Did Jesus Really Exist is what it was titled. And so I was very ecstatic to hear what we're about to hear mention, because I was like, oh shit, they watched my stuff. Or at least O'Neill did. Right. All right, so here we go. Let me know, you should be able to hear it, but let me know if you don't.
I thought that the first one that I wanted to go through is the idea of whether we have independent sources for Jesus at all, and therefore whether we can use those to answer the question regarding whether or not he existed. So you make the point that the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, Luke, John, and Thomas have some degree of independence as sources, and I think most people would be aware that there's interdependence textually between at least some of those.
Yeah.
But you argue that there's enough independence between those sources that we can regard them as, to a certain extent, as independent of each other. The mythicists counter that by saying, or respond to that by saying, you don't have any evidence for that. They say that actually there's nothing to preclude the idea that all of those other Gospels derive from Mark. Mm-hmm. So that there was this idea, there was a celestial Jesus that got historicized. Mark wrote these stories about a Jesus on earth, even though there hadn't been a previous belief in Jesus on earth. And then those other Gospels are riffs on the Gospel of Mark, so that you're wrong, and you also have no evidence. They refer to what they call the Ehrman circle. Don't know if you're familiar with this. No. This is where you assume something that assume that Jesus existed, make an argument based on that assumption, and then arrive at the conclusion from that argument that Jesus existed. So they claim.
Yes, so that is the Ehrman circle. I don't know, Rick. What do you think about his steel man of our position so far?
No, I feel like it's confused. So I'm a bit confused. I guess O'Neill wanted to only talk about mythicism and not just biblical history. So here's the thing that bugs me about this is that there's actually a huge debate right now in the field over this question, completely apart from mythicism. So I cite in my new book, Obsolete Paradigm, I cite a whole trend now. You got Robin Walsh, you've got Marcus Vincent, you've got all these other authors, scholars. These are like serious scholars with real PhDs and peer-reviewed monographs and everything, which I guess annoys them. But anyway, there's a lot of these people, not just the ones I named, who are pushing now against this idea that there are independent sources. None of these people I mentioned are mythicists, right? This is a debate within mainstream scholars who are taking the mainstream, sort of consensus position that exists now. Jesus existed, but we can't know anything about him because the Gospels there's no way to get historical information out of them. And so even like Justin Meggitt and like other scholars who have mentioned mythicism but aren't, sold on it, nevertheless are making the same point that where they're like, sure, Jesus existed, but we can't know anything about him from the Gospels because of this. So the idea being is like once Mark came out with his, all the others are just embellished redactions of that one, and we don't have any evidence that the subsequent Gospels have any sources other than their own imagination and things that aren't related to the history of Christianity because they're using other literature to emulate and things like that. And this is not mythicist position. This is like a mainstream position among a lot of scholars. And in fact, the trend in the last 10 years is towards this position, that to argue against oral lore theory and in favor of literary art theory. And therefore the Gospels become less and less usable as evidence. And so, but O'Neill has framed it as some sort of mythicist thing. And I think that's not what the critique is. So the critique is that Ehrman assumes there's an oral lore to create independent sources, and then uses those independent sources to argue for there being an oral lore. And that circle exists even if Jesus existed. Even if you're a historicist, that is still a circular argument. And this is Robin Faith Walsh's whole point, is like, this is a circular argument. When you go back and look at why anyone bought this idea of oral sources, it all falls apart. And when we put the Gospels in context, they're obvious literary art. So that it's much harder to even figure out, even if there is historical stuff in them, we have no way to know what it is, right? Because we can't establish this idea that, oh, this piece here is independent of this other piece. Not only independent, but they go back to Jesus and therefore tell us something about Jesus. It's almost impossible to do that because there's so much fabrication going on. And even Ehrman himself admits that the Gospels are mostly fabricated. So even he agrees that the prior probability of fabrication is higher than the prior probability of there being authentic material in the Gospels. And so he gets around this by just circularly presuming, whenever it's convenient, that something that's independent is actually from a source and not made up. Like for some reason, that one moment, they're suddenly being honest and not making something up. But he gives no evidence for that, right? That's the Ehrman circle. But by framing it as like mythicism, I think that gets Ehrman in the wrong mode. That Ehrman's going to be arguing against mythicism and not paying attention to the actual methodological point, right? Like there's a valid methodological point here that actually has nothing to do with mythicism. But what I fear here is he's going to get distracted and like do something about mythicism and miss the entire question, really. And I honestly think that's what O'Neill wants him to do. But anyway, we'll see.
All right.
Claim that your argument in relation to these Gospels' independence is an example of the Ehrman circle. So I'm putting you on the spot.
No, you're not at all. No, look, you have to look at every possibility. If you're being a serious historian, you look at every option and you figure out which ones have the evidence and which ones don't. May I ask, when they say that I have no evidence, they mean that Mark wrote, and then when John copied Mark somehow, the stuff that he didn't copy from Mark is just stuff he was making up? Is that it?
Yeah, that seems to be the argument. In fact, that's very much it.
I don't. Right. Is that the argument? Because my understanding, maybe I've got a wrong understanding. Well, my understanding was that John did have access to all of the previous Gospels.
Oh, correct. Yeah. I didn't take Ehrman as taking that position. Maybe he does. I don't know. I mean, this is actually mainstream now. So like the majority position of Johannine scholars is that John knew about the synoptics, especially Luke and Mark, and is in fact an argument against them, that he's specifically arguing against positions taken by Luke and Mark. So it's kind of a counter gospel. So it's not independent. But a good example to give here would have been to ask Bart Ehrman about the speeches in John, which are radically different style from any of the other surviving material in the Gospels that is attributed to Jesus. It's wildly bizarre. It's super late in construct. It doesn't match up with the kinds of things you see in the other Gospels or even in Paul. And it's like high style. So it's highfalutin. It's like weirdly philosophical in a way that wouldn't be what a rabbi of that time would be teaching. So I would be surprised if Ehrman would defend the speeches in the Gospel of John. I think most scholars altogether would say that those speeches are contrived, that the author of John invented those speeches to put into Jesus' mouth the theology that they wanted Jesus to preach. And that's not even a controversial thing to say. I would say like the majority of scholars who are experts on this and not fundamentalists would agree with that. So, but he's not giving an example that Ehrman would agree with. So they're kind of like dodging the real question here. But if the author of John invented all those long, elaborate, highfalutin speeches, well, maybe he invented Lazarus. Maybe he invented, right? It's like you keep going point after point. Why would you assume that that's not invented when most of it is invented? So we know the trend of the scholar is to invent things. So we would need evidence of something not being invented. We can't assume that something is not invented. We should assume the opposite, given the trend that these authors show. The author of the Gospel of John is obviously inventing tons of things. That's mainstream consensus position on John, is that a ton of it is made up. So any particular thing that you can't figure out if it's made up or not, you can't claim to know that it's not made up, right? The trend is that it is made up. And this is the kind of methodological problem that this is what the Ehrman circle is meant to sort of bypass this, that Ehrman will just pick a thing that he wants to be true, argue that somehow it's an exception to the rule with no particular evidence of it being an exception to the rule, and then use that as evidence that of the historical Jesus or something about the historical Jesus. And that's the circular argument that is common in his argumentation in general.
Mm-hmm. Oh, trust me, he's going to get to the juicy part here in a minute.
The argument they claim that your argument is they couldn't possibly have made all that stuff up.
Okay, that's not my argument. No, that's not my argument. But let me ask this: do they have evidence that John made it all up? In other words, do they have an argument? If they're saying that I'm assuming that, what evidence do they have that John was inventing everything else as opposed to having a source?
See, he goes, well, what evidence do they have that he's making it up? But it seemed like, just by what you said just a second ago, seems like there's plenty of evidence for that.
So, but also, we haven't finished Ehrman's argument here. So, like there's a valid line of thought here, is that, well, if we don't know that it's made, if we don't know that it's historical and you don't know it's made up, then neither of us can argue that it is or isn't. And I agree, right? Because there's tons of material in the Gospels that we just don't know. Like, we don't know if it's made up. We don't know if it's historical. There's no way to know, because you need evidence to get over that hurdle. So, but now there are cases where we do have evidence that it's made up, and it varies case by case, right? The case I just made for the speeches of John, that's not even the full case. Like, you look at the mainstream literature on John and the speeches in John, and you'll find, tons of examples of scholars pointing out how these are not historical, and from internal and external evidence, it doesn't make any sense as historical. So yeah, we do have evidence sometimes that things aren't historical. That's how we built up the case that we have tons of made up stuff in these Gospels. But there's no comparable case for there being stuff that goes back historically. And so this is where the evidence comes in, that's background evidence. So when you establish the background evidence, that the trend, and this is evidence, the trend in the evidence in John is to make stuff up. Like, overwhelmingly, most of the stuff in John is made up. Let's say it's 80%. With the other 20%, we don't know, but the 80% we can show is made up. Or lifted, right? Made up or lifted from Luke or lifted from Mark or whatever. But either way, not independent. If that's the case for 80%, then the stuff you don't know, the prior probability that it's also made up is 80%, right? So it's more likely to be made up, because that's what the trend in the evidence tells you, is that it's more likely to be made up. I think Ehrman wants to cast out all of this trend evidence. He wants to disregard all the background evidence and go back to straight agnosticism, ignoring all the evidence we have that these authors usually make things up. Like, he doesn't like the word usually, even though he'll use it, but then forget this mathematical significance of the word usually as soon as he needs to make an argument. And that's when he's slipping into his circle, the Ehrman circle.
Mm.
The arguments that they tend to make, and obviously I can't be comprehensive here, but I'll do my best to steelman what they say. The arguments they tend to make is that we know that at least some of the stuff in those other Gospels is likely to have been created by the authors.
Okay, what's the evidence of that?
Yes, very good question, but
there's no evidence of that.
Okay.
I mean, how do you know? How would you possibly know that somebody 2,000 years ago was either copying a source or making it up in his head? So how would you? What evidence would you have that he's making it up? We do have evidence that they're copying sources,
yeah.
And so it's wrong to say I don't have evidence for that, because when they say that Thomas is dependent on Mark, for example, when they say it's dependent on Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they're saying he had written sources. And if John is dependent on Mark, they're saying he has a written source. And if Luke used Matthew and Mark, then he had written sources. Luke tells us he had written sources. So I wouldn't say that it's just an assumption on my part. I'd say the default position is the one that we actually have evidence for, which is that they use sources. So if somebody wants to say that, they used Mark and made everything up, there is hardly anything in Mark that's in John. There are some stories that are similar, but they're not told in the same words. They're not the same story. It's really hard to make a case that John's based principally on Mark. I mean, what evidence is there for that?
Well, verbatim quotations, but apart from that,
only really verbatim.
Yeah, and also I'm surprised that Ehrman doesn't seem to understand or know. Like, all the leading Johannine experts have pointed out that John is heavily based on Luke, right? So by him picking Mark is weird. Like, he's acting like he doesn't know that it's Luke that we should be talking about. There's a lot of John that comes from Luke. There's also, like, we know, and I know people hate, especially Ehrman hates Dennis MacDonald and their argument, but Dennis MacDonald's in his Dionysian Gospel has an extremely good case for a lot of John being derived from the Bacchae of Euripides, right? So he's he's literally emulating Greek literature to make Jesus the better Bacchus. And so we have evidence of that as a case to make. Can't say there's no evidence, we're just making it up. No, we're not. We have actually evidence, we have a case to make. Even if you say it's a weak case, it's still, there's evidence, right? Even if it's weak evidence, it's evidence. I think it's actually better than that. It doesn't matter. It's still evidence either way, right? So to say there's no evidence, we have no argument. But notice also, like, Ehrman's asking O'Neill to try and, the most bad faith arguer that there is on the internet, he's asking him to steelman our points. And O'Neill clearly can't remember any of the arguments in, for example, chapter 10 of On the Historicity of Jesus, where I go item by item by item. I go through, like, scholars like Crossan and Allison, and, like, all of these leading scholars are making the case why most of the Sermon on the Mount is made up. There's an extensive case. It's well-based. It's evidence-based. It's mainstream. I mean, Dale Allison is a super mainstream scholar. So like, this is like, how does Ehrman not know any of that? Which tells me that he's never read the chapter, and neither has O'Neill, right? O'Neill's not read chapter 10 because he can't articulate a single argument from it. He can't get to the Sermon on the Mount case that I make, the triadic cycle case for the emulation of Moses and Mark, the Brody case for the emulation of the Elijah and Elisha cycle in Luke. Right, like, so he doesn't know any of it. He literally has never heard of any of this stuff and cannot articulate any of it to Bart Ehrman, and neither has Bart Ehrman heard any of it. He has no idea. He actually thinks we have no argument that the 100 pages I spend on the gospel says nothing, that there's no evidence in the 100 pages, which means he's not read it, right? Like, he doesn't know what he's talking about. This is the thing that kind of, which doesn't make any sense for a scholar of his experience and stature, for him to not know any of this. Boggles my mind. I don't even know, especially because I'm like, this is in mainstream stuff. Like, I'm quoting mainstream scholars and mainstream scholarship establishing these points. So yeah, we do have tons of evidence for a lot of stuff being made up. But I like one, like, so let's look at, like, there's this almost correct argument that Bart Ehrman makes there. At least it sounds Bayesian, where he's saying, well, the synoptics, and this doesn't really work for John, but they're talking about John, so this is kind of a bad argument in his case. But for the synoptics, he says, well, the synoptics, we can show, like, most of the material in Luke, let's say, copies from Mark and Matthew. Therefore, the extra stuff in Luke must come from another source. Like, so he's trying to get the same argument I made. Let's say 80% of Luke comes from a source. Therefore, the remaining 20% of Luke must come from another source. That doesn't work as an argument because the only reason we know the 80% is because we have the sources, right? We don't have the sources. And so there's no way to know in there whether it's made up or comes from a source. So the remaining 20%, we don't know, right? We're back to that agnosticism that Bart Ehrman was pushing 5 seconds ago. So what do you do with the agnosticism? Well, now you go at, well, what usually appears in a gospel that isn't from a source. So, like, what usually shows up in Luke that's not in Mark and Matthew? It's usually made up stuff, like the Elijah-Elisha cycle stuff, right? Which we have a ton of evidence is made up and is just making Jesus sound like Elijah and Elisha. And he's borrowed the idea from Mark, because Mark does a little of this already, and Luke just runs with it and makes it a bigger text, right? So that, again, that of that 20%, 80% is probably made up at least. So any particular thing we pick in there, odds are it's made up. And even if you want to push back against that prior probability argument, all you end up with, even with all the pushback you can give, we end up with not knowing. So we end up with nothing. So there's no way, there's no road here to there being historical material in that remaining 20%. There's no way to get that logically. There's no way to get it evidentially. There's no way to get it probability wise or anything like that. So this is a dead end argument. And the reason is that Ehrman ends up leaning on his circular point. Is that, well, if we don't know where it came from, it must have come from oral lore, therefore it goes back to Jesus, etc. Or like, that's the circular argument. So that's the one thing that we have no evidence of and we don't know, right? But we do have evidence that they make stuff up, and we do have evidence they use sources that also made stuff up, right? So like they're not historical sources, they're not reliable. So that's the kind of silliness that's going on here, and it just astonishes me to see Bart Ehrman still doing this after being told this is a bad argument by multiple scholars over years. But that's what we see happening.
Yeah. For me, though, I think that what Bart does is that he actually goes a little bit farther, not just that automatically assuming that there are sources that they're copying from, but they are independent sources,
right?
Which kind of seems weird considering you can't actually analyze those sources to determine.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. That's a really good point, because so, for example, Ehrman used to hate Goodacre. I don't know. It sounds like he's sympathetic to Goodacre now because he's talking about Luke copying from Matthew. But Ehrman used to be a Q guy. He used to be pro Q. So there must have been this Q, right? And we've had a lot of scholars, not just Goodacre and Golder and all these others that we've got, like Dennis MacDonald has done a whole Q analysis and so on. He has his own Q theory, etc. But he does a very thorough analysis. So does Goodacre and so on, showing that if you look at what Q is, there's actually no evidence that Mark isn't a source for Q. In other words, the assumption is that Q is somehow a source that predates Mark, but there's no evidence of that. What it looks, I mean, honestly, it looks like Matthew, right? So the Q looks a lot like Matthew, which is odd. Simple Occam's razor would suggest that it is Matthew, and therefore there's no extra Q document. But Dennis MacDonald makes a good case to say that even if there was a Q, we have good evidence to suggest that Mark is also using it, or Q used Mark. So you have like Mark and Matthew. What if there's a third gospel that everybody's calling Q that used Mark and Matthew and then added stuff, and Luke is using that source, right? So like that gets rid of your question, which is, Well, that's not independence, because that source is embellishing with extra things, and it's just copying these other guys who aren't quoting oral lore either. They're just making up stories and fanciful triadic construction and so on. So, you know, it's like, so when you do the full literary analysis, even if you get to sources, that doesn't get you to sources that are independent of Matthew and Mark, and it doesn't get you to sources that go back to Jesus or even predate the war, right? So you're right. He's like adding stacks and stacks of assumptions here for which there is no evidence, and that makes your position less and less probable, because every assumption comes with its improbability. So it's 50-50 one and 50-50 the other. Having both those assumptions is 25%. So now you've really tanked your argument, because you've reduced it by 25% instead of the 50% you were reducing it by before. Or you can do what we do and not reduce it by either of any of that stuff, right? So anyway, you're right to point that out, that for him to jump immediately from source to source that goes back to Jesus, and therefore an independent source, is an extra leap. So there's two circular arguments going on there.
Yeah, he makes an argument that really flabbers my gasts, or makes it flabbergast me here in a minute.
Flabbers my gast. That sounds right, actually.
Yeah.
Isn't gast for ghost, right?
Maybe. All right. So my flabbers were gasted. They were. Maybe that's the right way to say it.
Okay, again, I'm going to play devil's advocate, but let's take the Jesus' return to Nazareth in the synoptics. In Mark, it's a fairly bald story. He goes back to Nazareth. People are skeptical about him. He can't do any major miracles. In Luke, there's a much more additional element to the narrative. He picks up the Isaiah scroll. He reads from it. He declares himself to be the fulfillment of that prophecy.
Sorry. Oh, I thought you said something. Okay.
You would say that is not the author of Luke adding a narrative element, in other words, making it up?
Oh, I don't know about that story. I mean, that story, that's a very important story. Luke has clearly changed what's going on. For one thing, he's made it the very first thing that Jesus does in his ministry, as opposed to Mark, where it's right smack in the middle. It's actually toward the end of his ministry. And Luke appears to have done that because it shows so well his overarching theme in both Luke and Acts, that Jesus was to be rejected by the Jews so that the message can go to the Gentiles. So if you read that story carefully, that's what it's about. So did Luke invent that part of it? He may have. Yeah. That has nothing to do with whether Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are entirely made up, because I mean, everybody in this, they made up some things.
Nothing to do. Nothing to do. Nothing to see here. That's not evidence of a trend. Okay. Yeah. Kind of silly, but yeah. He's really hell-bent on trying to get something historical to be in the Gospels, right? He just can't just admit, like, say, yeah, actually, we don't know whether there's anything historical in the Gospels. Like, that's what most of his peers in this field say. That's like, we don't know. None of the methods work. Like, all the studies that have been published about the methodology to extract history from the Gospels, all of them, literally all of them, have found that they don't work. Right. And there was a recent book that came out that it was called, what was it? Like the New Quest or something like that for the historical Jesus. I can't remember the title, but where they completely abandon any attempt to reconstruct a historical Jesus, admit that there's no way we can reconstruct a historical Jesus. So what we'll do is we'll just talk about the literary and cultural context of early Christianity and the Gospels and stuff like that. And it's kind of like a quiet admission of what Ehrman is really resisting admitting here, which is that we don't know the thing that Ehrman was saying. That we don't know that there's these independent sources, and we don't know that those sources, even if they existed, go back to any authentic material. And like, he just can't admit that. Like, all the mainstream scholars admit this, but he can't admit it because it's conceding too much to what he perceives to be the enemy. I think there's this sort of an emotional resistance, and I think this is why O'Neill has kind of trapped him by triggering him by framing this as about mythicism rather than a mainstream historicist debate, right? If he had framed it by talking about like Walsh or Vincent or Trobish or all these other like scholars who've written all of this stuff about these things. By the way, all of this I cite, I get the whole bibliography and show what's happened in the last 10 years on this in Obsolete Paradigm of a Historical Jesus. So if people want to see what's happened in the 10 years since my original study came out, you can see that the trend is heading in my direction where I already was in chapter 10 of On the Historicity of Jesus. But for people who want to see examples of the evidence of how this stuff is made up, why we do have evidence of this stuff being made up, and therefore the trend suggests that it's all made up. That's on the historicity of Jesus. But I give a really good example in chapter 6 of Obsolete Paradigm, where I take the two swords story, where Jesus has this weird saying about two swords being enough for something. And I look at Bermejo Rubio's argument that it's proof that Jesus was an armed rebel. And I look at Justin Meggett's counter argument to him that it's no, they just had sacrificial knives. And there really were two. That's why the number is two, because it's a historical event. And I explain why those are bad arguments and don't hold up against all the evidence that this is actually a story that Luke deliberately made up. And so that's a good example of seeing what kind of evidence we can have that shows that this is a made-up story, and that the arguments that it's not a made-up story, that it somehow goes back to a real thing, are bad arguments. That they're the ones who lack evidence and grate against the evidence. But you'd have to really do it. You'd have to go look at this case and take it seriously, and not be all flippant and disregard it and not even bother learning any of this and just denying it from the armchair. That's not what scholars should be doing. They should be looking at this kind of stuff to see how these kinds of arguments unfold, and how they're unfolding over and over and over again. The trend is not in the direction that Bart Ehrman wants it to be.
Yeah. So what struck me about this particular section was so my understanding, and I could be wrong, is that, we do have good evidence for some things being made up, but for the things that we don't know where it came from, there's no way for us to know if it was cited from oral source, written source, or if it was made up. And so we just simply can't say one way or another. But it seems to me that Bart is thinking that the mythicist argument is that anything that doesn't derive from the previous gospels is wholly made up. And we're rejecting the idea of there being any kind of other source other than imagination. And it seems like here in this particular section that we just listened to, Ehrman admits, there are made up things. So it's he's sitting there saying they have no evidence that things were made up. And then he says, oh, but look, this part's made up. And so it's okay, then, you admit that there's evidence of things being made up. What the fuck are you talking about?
Yeah, you've got him. You've got his number there. That's spot on. And I think it's also worth pointing out that that's why you have these two levels of circular argumentation going on. You're right. We don't. So first of all, he's confusing ignorance with denial, right? So we're saying that you, Bart Ehrman, are as ignorant as we are as to what goes back to oral sources or lost written sources. We don't know that. You don't know that. Let's just stop, right? Let's stop pretending that it's anything other than that. But also those sources, oral source or written source, could also be making stuff up. Right. So when we say the stuff is made up, we aren't necessarily saying that Luke made up everything in Luke. I think that's the case. And I think we can make a good argument that it's the case. I think Brody made a really excellent, extensive case for this. And then we could add in, Randall Helms, and we could add in Dennis MacDonald, and we could add in the stuff that I've pointed out. We could add the scholars who caught the whole cycle between the 12-year-old Jesus and the Emmaus narrative. They're actually meant to sew into each other. There's a new book out that I cite in Obsolete Paradigm that shows the entire Gospel of Luke is structured in a ring structure, in a way that I showed for Matthew in Obsolete, and on the Historicity of Jesus. But there's a new scholar who's come out and showed that Luke is doing it too, and actually it's a pretty good case. And in fact, inadvertently, my finding of the Emmaus narrative and 12-year-old Jesus story lineup fits so well into that guy's case that it actually bolsters it, because he finds the same connection between those two, but misses the evidence that I found that they are connected. So it adds evidence. So it shows that two independent scholars came at this and found the same thing, but found different things that corroborate the same conclusion. And that's very unlikely unless we're right? So that's the kind of thing that these guys, they're just completely ignoring and not interacting with, and just dismissing altogether from the armchair for no reason. But we have a ton of that kind of stuff. But I think even if we grant could be oral lore, could be written sources, we have no evidence of that, but whatever. You still don't know that those are made up versus real, right? So if they could be just as made up as the sources of Mark and Matthew are. And so that doesn't really help, right? And the example I gave long ago, it's in my Ehrman recap article, is Ehrman trying to claim that there's a mention of an Aramaic word in the Janaius resurrection story. And therefore that shows that it goes back to first century Palestinian Aramaic source. And I'm like, well, first of all, that's a complete non sequitur. That doesn't follow at all, for many reasons, not least of all that like Aramaic was a language spoken across the Middle East for hundreds of years. It doesn't go back to first century Palestine. It's the word. It's just one word, and it's a word that probably comes from a Targum. And anyway, just go on and on. It's a dumb argument that falls apart on any review. But the thing is it's obvious the Janaius story is made up, right? It's a fake story about the resurrection of a 12-year-old girl inside the curing of the old woman who had been hemorrhaging for 12 years. It's an obvious circular fictional story meant to convey messages symbolically about the gospel. There was no resurrection of Jairus's daughter, and there was no Jairus. The name is made up. Like, you can show contextually the name fits the context, just like the Old Testament names like Adam and Abraham and stuff that are made up to fit the context of the stories they're in. And so it's just, there's tons of evidence that's a made up story. So even if we could argue that it comes from a, let's say, early first century Palestinian source, we can't argue that. There's no evidence of that. And none of the evidence that Ehrman is referring to is evidence of that. It doesn't it's a non sequitur. It's basically a standard fallacy. And I show that in that recap. Ehrman hates the word fallacy. He never wants to learn logic and despises any effort to logic check anything he argues. No, I'm not even joking. Like, he gets angry when you start talking about fallacies. Oh, fallacies! Stop talking about fallacies. It's like, you should know about fallacies. That's your entire profession is based on avoiding them. Really, you should be expert at this, as expert at this as I am. But no, it's obviously made up. So even if it went back to some sort of oral Aramaic source, that oral Aramaic source made up this story, right? So so you can't get back to a real event in the life of Jesus this way. So that's the second circular argument that's subsumed here that you pointed out. And so, yeah, you made a good point there. And it's good to keep carrying that ball through, because so people don't get lost the way that Ehrman and O'Neill are already lost on this distinction.
Yeah, we do have a super chat to address. We've got South Galician, who says, could chapter 93 of the Acts of John be evidence of Docetism? Thanks.
Okay, God, I don't remember. Let's see. I would have to check that out. I have to look that up to find out. Because I have a long list of things. That doesn't stick in my head, but I'll see it really quick here.
Yeah, I know that in Obsolete Paradigm you illuminate some of the new research done on Docetists, right? Or is that Gnostics?
Yeah, both. But yeah, I do
Okay.
the whole chapter is mostly on Docetism. The Gnosticism thing is also relevant. I have a little section on that in the same chapter. But okay, so I'm talking about. So I have one reference to the Acts of John in that chapter that we're talking about Docetism. And it's a footnote about Hochlatube, who's one of these scholars who's agreeing with me that Docetism didn't exist. And he talks about passages in the Acts of John. And I just mentioned that for readers who want to dive into that. So look at that source. You want to look at what Hochlatube says about the role of the Acts of John and passages there and Docetism. Check that out. Now, why didn't I bring that evidence in myself? I must not have found it very convincing. So I can't remember now. I've the Acts of John I usually look at for a bunch of other things. So it's like there's the weird the bed bug miracle, and there's a passage in there referring to a resurrection that uses the same language that shows up in the Testimonium Flavianum. And so I'm usually doing with Acts of John and other stuff. So I can't remember if the Acts of John had any. I don't recall it having any good evidence for Docetism, or what we think. No one, it's the mainstream experts in Docetism don't think Docetism existed. So when we say evidence of Docetism, we mean evidence of whatever it actually was that modern scholars confused for Docetism. I didn't see it there. So, or it was ambiguous, like too ambiguous to use. But I'm just going off of memory here, and I don't remember the content of chapter 93, so I can't really give you a solid answer on that. It would be a good one if you want to bring that up, like on my blog somewhere. Like, go to my blog, search for any related article. I have an open thread on the historicity of Jesus. You could pick that article or whatever. Put your question in the comments below that, like post a comment with that question, and then that will spur me to go recheck the chapter 93 of Acts of John, and maybe that will remind me of what I saw there the last time I looked.
Yeah, definitely. And just to remind everybody, $5 and up super chats are going to, that's the teal super chats. Anything that and up, we will prioritize during the stream. So definitely get your questions in. We would love to answer them as we go through them. We still have a few minutes left in this particular section, and he hasn't gotten to the part yet where it's flabbered my guests or whatever. Because he says something like last night, Rick, I messaged you and I was like,
Yeah.
Oh my God, he's a totally incompetent scholar. And it was
You're talking
that
about
one
O'Neill.
of these parts.
O'Neill,
No, I was talking about Bart.
Oh, okay. Well, let's see it. All right.
Yeah, so I suppose the argument,
they use sources. What?
so I suppose the argument that they're making is that if we agree that they made up some things, then why couldn't they have made up all of the stuff?
Okay, let's say they could have. Okay, let's say they could have. What's the evidence?
Yeah.
So don't.
I mean, I would say, what's the evidence for the story that they just talked about being made up? Like Bart admits that it was.
Bart even gave some of the evidence, right? He stated reasons for Luke to make it up, right? That's evidence. Yeah, we have tons of evidence, but obviously it varies pericope by pericope, right? Like there's no universal evidence that applies to all of them. So you have to dig in and look at the case. There's a reason I have 100 pages on this in my original study. Is I go through and look, there's so many cases, and so many scholars agree with this. And there's so much evidence for each case. And then I have a section on what then do we do with cases where we don't know, right? We don't have this evidence that I just surveyed for all these other passages. So I present a methodological, how do we handle those cases? And it is ultimately, it's the agnostic, it's 50-50, so we can't do anything with it. So we can't argue pro or con. And so the evidence just becomes useless. It's evidence of neither theory. And so, which is the agnosticism, the ignorance position, which Ehrman sometimes here admits to and other times is denying. And it's hard to keep track of what coherent position is even taking here. But anyway, that's all in our study. And O'Neill seems not to have any knowledge of this. And he likes to say, well, I have no evidence. I don't know why. It's just no evidence. I don't know what they're talking about. And yet we have tons of evidence in this thing. So, and obviously Ehrman is the same. He keeps asking, where's the evidence? There's no evidence, which means, again, neither of these guys have read any of chapter 10 of On the Historicity of Jesus, which proves that Ehrman has never read my book, despite him sometimes lying and claiming that he did. It's obvious that he didn't hear this. There's no way that he could not come up with some examples from that chapter to discuss here, or at least criticize, right? Well, I think he's wrong he gives this example. I think he's wrong, and here's why. He doesn't even do that. He thinks there's no evidence, that we have no evidence. We present no evidence. Where's the evidence, O'Neill? Where is it? I don't know. It's just it irks me. It really, you talk about being flabbergasted. I'm just kind of pissed off, right? It won't, why not just say, look, I didn't read the book. I'm not really interested in reading the book. I don't know what's in it. So I don't really have criticisms because I don't know what it is. I don't know what the arguments are. I can't criticize them. But no, he pretends to know what's in the book. And that's just, it's dishonest to me, right? It's just, I don't know. It's unprofessional, I think, is the way I would characterize it.
Yeah, it definitely is. Hopefully we're getting to the part. I know that it's coming up soon.
I don't think they should accuse me of not having evidence, because I have solid evidence that they used sources.
Yeah.
And I want to know what evidence they have that everything was made up.
So he's conflating now. He has solid evidence that they used those sources, Mark and Matthew. Now he's conflating that with having solid evidence that they used other lost sources. That's a non sequitur. Just because you have evidence that they used the sources we know about, that is not inherently evidence that they had other sources for the other material. You need to make a case for that other material coming from a source. You can't just assume it. And half the time he admits this, and right now he's denying this. So he has no coherent methodological position here. And so it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me why he's even going on this tack. Why not just actually admit that we don't know. We have evidence for Luke and Matthew being sources for Matthew and Mark for being sources for Luke. We don't have evidence for any other sources for Luke. I'm just going to assume that there were, right? Or I'm not even going to assume there were. I don't know if there were. Maybe it's made up. Maybe there was a source and maybe the source made it up. I don't know. He won't admit to not knowing something. But also the fact that he's not aware of the fact that we have tons of evidence for them making things up. Like, he seems to have no idea of this, is alarming. I think it's disingenuous.
Mm-hmm. No, I totally agree.
So I'm just saying their argument against me. I'm saying, like, I think it's wrong about me because we have evidence that they are. But where's the evidence that everything else is made up in their own heads?
Yeah. But back to you obviously believe that it is far more likely that there were independent sources other than Mark. And
I think there's good evidence for it. There's really good evidence for it because Matthew and Luke, for example, have a number of passages that are in common that are not in Mark. So how do they have word-for-word agreements in passages that are not in Mark unless they have the same sources?
Okay.
So
Yes.
we're talking about
If two people are making up a story, suppose
There's
somebody
the
make
Q
up a story
argument.
about you.
Yeah.
There he's defending Q. He's not explaining it to the audience, but he's defending Q. Q is a terrible theory. Like, it's so thoroughly refuted. I don't even know why he's still hung up on it. But he does the same thing. He says Goodacre never convinced them, but every time he talks about it, it suggests to me that he doesn't even know what Goodacre's arguments are. So I don't think he's ever actually read Goodacre's books on Q or on the Gospel of Thomas, which is really important addition to this, or his new book, which just came out. I don't know if it's actually available yet. I've read some reviews, but there's of the Gospel of John. So Goodacre has a whole book on that, and they're really freaking good, or at least this last one. It sounds like it's really good. I'm expecting good things because from what I've heard of the reviews and what I've heard of what I've seen in the other two books. So anyway, yeah, there's like Ehrman won't read these books. He's just declared them false, is uninterested in what the arguments are, and just takes this assumption that, well, therefore Q theory is true. I just don't like Goodacre, and I'm just not going to read any of his arguments. He's clearly wrong about stuff. He's this fringer. No one listens to him, which is also false. I show in the last 10 years, Goodacre is gaining a lot more ground with scholars, and it's snowballed into more and more support for Goodacre's position in the last 10 years. I cite the bibliography. I show this. So that's an obsolete paradigm as well. So like the trend is against Ehrman here. He's kind of like one of these old guards. He's just stuck in his ways and can't change his mind. And so really we just have to wait for him to go away until the field will finally like be allowed to move away from his old hardline indefensible positions, I guess. I don't know. It's just like with Moses and the patriarchs and Thomas Thompson back in the 70s.
Yeah. So the moment that caused me to message you last night is coming up here in just a second.
So then we're talking about
if two people are making up a story, suppose somebody like make up a story about you, like suppose you got two people make up a story about you, and it turns out they've got entire paragraphs of the same, and they haven't consulted with each other. How's that work? Word for word the same. It doesn't. You can't do it. And so this is not like a debate issue. Of course they had sources. How else are they going to have word for word agreements?
So that's the Q material, but of course mythicists go with those non-mythicist scholars who believe that there wasn't Q and have other arguments for how there is that
the arguments that Luke used Matthew.
Yeah,
that means it's another source. It has to be a written source because they're word for word the same.
Okay, but if Matthew was
he's
just
confusing
from
them. I feel like O'Neill is getting frustrated. I'm getting an air of frustration from O'Neill, where even Ehrman is confusing cases where we do have evidence of a source use, and then assuming that therefore we get to assume that there are these lost sources, even though we have no evidence for those sources. Somehow it magically rubs off, like the evidence for of Luke using Matthew magically rubs off as evidence for Luke using some other document that we don't have. That's a non sequitur. That's not how this works. Like the reason we agree Luke used Matthew and therefore used that source is that we have evidence of it. And that is what we don't have for this other stuff. And here, notice how Ehrman's going on the circle. Like this is Ehrman's circle where he's like saying, like, he keeps saying that, well, we have evidence for Luke using Matthew. Therefore, we have evidence of Luke using Joe or whatever. It's like, no, we don't. Those are completely different. You have one case where you have no evidence, and one case where you have evidence. Why are you conflating them? This is methodologically irrational. I don't understand why he keeps doing this.
Yeah, and keep in mind, this is Ehrman arguing for the Gospels being independent sources, like independent of each other.
Yeah.
Well, having, I guess that should be specific.
No,
that they have independent aspects to them.
That some of their material has other sources that we don't have. That's what he's claiming. So everybody agrees that Luke had Matthew and Mark as a source. Like no one's arguing that, right? Like that's not that's not the issue here. So what he wants to say is that the material that's left over, so like the material that Luke didn't copy from Matthew and that Matthew didn't get from Mark, automatically therefore comes from a magical document that he labels M, right? And there's this lost document or oral lore or whatever. He's very vague on what it is. Sometimes he says it's a lost Aramaic source. Like he actually, I don't know where he gets any of that information. He'll say it's 1st century. We have no evidence 1st century, no evidence that it's Aramaic. We have no evidence that it even existed. But he just asserts this, and he's done that like in public. He's just outright asserted that we have these lost sources, and then backtracks his language. So, well, I meant have in a sort of figurative sense. He said, well, that's not what you said. You just misled entire, a million readers and didn't correct it. So why, like, where's the professional ethics there? But anyway, but yeah, it's this whole conflation of when we have evidence of a use of a source, and he wants to assume, therefore, that we just magically, therefore, have imaginary evidence that is just as good, that shows that he used this other source that we don't have, and that's the Ehrman circle, where you're just assuming you have stuff to get that to be the case, and then use that as evidence of the case, and that's a circular argument.
Yeah. We did get a couple of super chats in. Another one from South Galician, who says, Ehrman and Goodacre recently debated Gospel John's dependency on the synoptics. Ehrman appealed to community traditions, and Goodacre failed to push back.
Yeah, I didn't see that debate. I would imagine Goodacre wouldn't push back on that, because that's the Ehrman circle, right? Like, just community traditions, just saying, well, I mean, you're just asserting that. Like, do you have any evidence of that? Goodacre's point is the same point that all Johannine scholars have been pointing out for the last 5 to 10 years, maybe 20 years, as far back as I saw. They're arguing that John gets a lot of material from the synoptics. And so Goodacre's argument in his new book is just to cull all of that information to show where John is getting information from the synoptics, where he's arguing against Luke, where he's inverting Mark, and presumably he'll have the references to Matthew, although there's a scant few claims to John using Matthew, but Luke and Mark essentially. So he's arguing for the positive case. So for Ehrman to just come in here and throw in, well, I just think it's community traditions. Well, that's not really an argument. How do you push back on that? Like, do you have any evidence that it's community traditions? Do you have evidence that there's this community and that it had these traditions, and that this author, that's where he got this information? Or how is the community tradition any different from the author just making it up, when it's just the community making it up and the author is just writing it down, right? Like, so I don't know, like, what pushback you could give there other than the sort of methodological point that I just made.
Yeah. And then we've got another super chat from Kristen Hood saying, is it Lo or Io Saturnalia? At this time, we remember an ancient celestial figure who was euhemerized as a wise Latium king.
Okay, hold on. I'm having trouble. I need volume. Can you speak?
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Test.
Okay, good.
Test. Okay.
Yeah, I was having a technical issue. Okay, solved. All right. Yeah. I'm sorry. Back to it. Yes.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Kristen Hood. Io Saturnalia. At this time, we remember an ancient celestial figure who was euhemerized as a wise Latium king.
Referring to Romulus. Yeah. I assume. Yeah.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, South Galician. Y'all are awesome. Please keep sending in those super chats. That's how we pay for Richard's time here. So definitely keep sending those in.
Romulus is also one of those gods that in one tradition was virgin born, and also he's a pre-existent being made incarnate, who like, he was a god, was given flesh to preach to the earthlings, and then went up to outer space, and then visited in visions from outer space to communicate his final gospel or whatever. So there is actually a good Christmas tie-in to Romulus. You could totally do a Christmas Romulus story. So instead of the nativity, you've got well, actually it wouldn't be the conception. It'd be the nativity is not really significant, but what's the significant one is the Epiphany, right? When Romulus appears to Proculus on the road to Alba Longa and says, hey, I was a god and I was made incarnate and I was born to the virgin, yada, yada. Here's this. So you could totally do like a Romulus sort of take on Christmas, and do like a pagan heathen play that would piss everybody off.
Yeah. They regularly get pissed off whenever you compare Jesus to previous gods.
Yeah,
That's definitely something that pisses people off.
yeah. It's a trigger. It's a trigger, just like mentioning mythicists from Anil to Ehrman here.
Yeah. Okay. So this flabbered my Gaston. Maybe it won't flabber yours as much as it flabbered mine, but we're right on the precipice of it.
Here we go.
I was pretty appalled by what he said.
It has to be a written source because they're word for word the same.
Okay, but if Matthew was just riffing from Mark, doesn't that still sustain their argument?
No, because Luke then has two sources. Written sources. I'm not saying that that's the way it is, because I don't think it is the way, but I'm saying they are admitting that Luke used two sources.
Yeah.
Luke, so this is what really got me, is that he's saying, oh, well, then they're admitting that Luke had two sources, when in reality, what we're saying is we're looking for independent sources. And it seems to me
yes, that's
like
a good point.
he doesn't understand what an independent source is.
Yeah, I mean, or he's forgetting, because I know he has in the past explained the difference between independent and dependent sources. And so he knows the difference. I don't think that's, I don't know why he's forgetting that, but you're right. He's forgetting that right here, that somehow he slipped into the mode of like, I can't believe they agree that that Luke used Matthew and Mark. He used two sources. They agree with this. It's like, yeah, we've literally, that's part of our argument. I don't know why you think that's a shocking admission or whatever. And you're right. The reason that's weird and that doesn't make a lot of sense, like what is he arguing at this point? It doesn't make any sense, is because that thing that you caught, that he is conflating the independent sources with sources question, right? And so he's completely lost track of the original question. And I see him do that a lot. Like, this isn't the only time I've seen him do this, where he once you get, it's like, I don't know, there's certain scholars that you get them talking about a subject and they just can't get off their pet peeves on that subject, right? And they're just stuck. And they're like, wait, did you forget like what you said this other time? And I actually asked you a different question, but no, he's like stuck in this mode of having to say, those mythicists are ridiculous for admitting that Luke had sources, multiple sources. And it's like, that's not what we're doubting. Like, we're not challenging that. But he's forgotten what the argument was, what the question was that he was even supposed to be answering.
Yeah.
So why did they say then Luke made everything up?
And Luke talks about how there have been multiple accounts, and that he's trying to pull them all together. So
yeah, he's trying to write an accurate account. So he doesn't think his predecessors are good, which is kind of telling, because Mark was one of his predecessors, and it seems like he doesn't think Mark was accurate. Yeah.
They also argue that Goodacre has proven definitively, that's their word, that Thomas is derived from the Synoptics. How would you respond to that?
Well, he hasn't proven it definitively, because some of us don't buy it, but he certainly has the best arguments one could make for it. So when we talk.
So the problem that I had with that statement right there, and why I included it, is that he seems to, and I know that this would grate on Ehrman's nerves, but he seems to be using an ad populum argument, even if it's an ad populum of, scholars or whatnot, New Testament scholars or textual critics or whatever. He seems to be making an ad populum argument, and that seems to be a bit fallacious to me, because it's like, Goodacre does have good arguments, solid arguments, and so like, saying that he's definitively proven it doesn't require the majority of people to accept it.
Yeah. Also, I should point out that, again, Ehrman is arguing with the fallacy of black and white again, where whatever you think of Goodacre's arguments regarding Thomas, they're definitely far and away extensive and good enough to establish that you can't argue the reverse, right? So he's got it to the point where, well, now we don't know. Maybe we don't know if the stuff that's in Thomas that's unique doesn't, or it comes from something other than the Synoptics. We don't know now, or we don't know whether Thomas is independent of the Synoptics, because there's this case and we can't really refute it. We don't have any contrary evidence to it. So even the worst case scenario, you could say, well, now we've gotten to the point of agnosticism. We can't use Thomas as an independent source because we don't know. And so Ehrman has a hard time. This happens a lot. He has a very hard time contemplating doubt or uncertainty. So like when it comes to just saying we don't know, like he'll flippantly say that from time to time to make something go away, but he never really commits to it as a methodological position where you just say, actually, we don't know. And that is not the same thing as saying Goodacre is right. What we're saying is that he's made enough of a case that we don't know that the alternative is right. So that even at best, like even at most favorable to Ehrman, what Ehrman, what Goodacre establishes that we don't know now. So we have to rule that out. We can't establish that is independent. That's not the same thing as asserting that it's not independent, right? Like, you can't tell these two things apart. That saying that we don't know that it's independent is not the same thing as saying that we know that it is not independent, right? These are very different statements. Now, I also happen to think Goodacre's proved the more difficult statement. He's proved that we have evidence that they are dependent and not, that the Gospel of Thomas is dependent and not independent. But even if you don't follow me that far down the road, you can't go you have to go at least as far as the agnosticism that Goodacre established. And Ehrman's like completely floundering on this here. But back to your point, this happens a lot. I think the field is caught in a lot of, it conflates arguments from prestige with actual legitimate arguments from consensus. So Ehrman says, well, the guys I read or the friends that I have cocktails with say Goodacre's full of shit, therefore Goodacre's full of shit. But he's not asking, did any of those people, including you, Dr. Ehrman, did any of those people actually read the book, right? Did you just go to the debate and just like half-ass it from the armchair at the podium? Or did you really actually consider the case, right? So first of all, you have to ask all the people who actually read the book, Goodacre's book, took it seriously, and had thoughtful things to say about it. Those are the only people whose opinions matter. All other scholars in the field don't know what they're talking about because they have not read the book. So they can't say Goodacre's full of shit because they don't know what Goodacre argued, right? So there's this assumption that, well, I get to cite everybody in the field, even the people who've never read the book, and therefore their opinions are enough to eliminate Goodacre's book. And it's like, that's actually illegitimate consensus. So but that's very common in this field. It would not be accepted in other fields of history. You would get trashed in ancient Roman studies or American history or anything like that if you tried to pull that shit in there, right? But here in biblical studies, you're allowed to do this. You're allowed to just, 1,000 scholars say Goodacre is wrong, even though none of them read the book and have no idea what he argued. But that's good enough for me. That happens a lot in this field, and it's kind of one of the big black spots, one of the major methodological failures that's very common in this field. What you want to know is you want to see like what if you could, and no one's in this field is spending the money to do this, and they should. In philosophy, they do this. There's actually a thing called Phil Paper's survey that every few years actually surveys what the positions are of philosophers in different things. Now that just surveys their positions. It doesn't ask them if they've studied them, right? So that's kind of one flaw in the thing. But you could do that and start polling scholars and say, well, these scholars have made this argument, and have you check a box? Did you read them, or have you read what their arguments? Did you read their studies? Like, don't give the, well, I read a critic. That doesn't count. You have to read the studies themselves, and you only count the opinions of the people who check the boxes that I read that stuff. And of course, even that's going to be a little skewed because some of them are going to lie, right? Like they're going to pretend, like Bart Ehrman has done. He's lied. He said he's read my book. We've just proved here that he has not. So he's a liar, right? Like that's I'm sorry, that's just the case. So he would check the box. Yeah, I've read it. Just so that he would have his vote would be counted, right? Like he's that dishonest, I think. But if we hope that most scholars are honest, hopefully the liars who check the box but shouldn't are few. We should hope that. Then we could look at their opinions and see what is the percentage of their opinions who agree with Goodacre or not, because those are the only opinions that matter. And if like someone like Ehrman says, well, that's not enough people, the solution is to get more people to read the book, right? So that more people can check the box and so that you can get a broader opinion. The objective should not be, oh, don't read the book because he's full of shit. I didn't read it. None of my colleagues read it, but it's full of shit. So you shouldn't read it either. You should just agree with us. Like that's exactly the opposite and wrong position to take, because it methodologically destroys the reliability of the entire field of biblical studies, that this is the standard way of behaving. And I think it's a serious, serious problem in biblical studies, and they're doing nothing to solve it. And I think people need to remember that and take that into account. So I think your point is really important to point that out, is like you can't just randomly pick opinions of people who don't know what they're talking about. Just because they have PhDs and study the subject doesn't mean they know what they're talking about, because to know what they're talking about, they'd have to know what Goodacre said, right? Because that's what we're supposed to be talking about. What are his arguments? Not like, what is your opinion when you looked at the stuff independently of his arguments? That's not the opinion that matters here. Anyway, so that's a soapbox for me that I'm getting annoyed by this more and more as I see this happen more and more in the field to many other scholars, not just to me. It's not just me and Goodacre. It's happening to both of us, but it happens to many other scholars. This sort of flippant, we're not even going to pay attention to what you're saying, but call it bullshit anyway, and then cite each other, like circle jerk each other and quote each other, even though none of us have read this stuff, and so we really don't have an informed opinion. But we're going to represent ourselves to the public as though we've read it and have an opinion, and therefore our opinion is valid, and you should listen to it. Like, that's argument from prestige, which is a fallacy, and that shouldn't exist.
Yeah, and I have to question, because like Ehrman seems to be a bit behind on where the field is in general, and what arguments are gaining more and more traction to the point where you could consider it to be the, becoming the consensus of the field. So I I don't know if anybody should trust him when he says, well, not everybody is convinced of this, so it's not true. I feel like you have to be like, well, is that really it? Like, because he seems to be behind on a bunch of things.
Yeah, and that the Gospel of John is a good example of this, because one of the points that I know that Goodacre makes in his book, I haven't read it yet, but I know it's in there, is that's the trend in the field. The Johannine experts, pretty much all of them now, agree that John is based on the synoptics. Like, that's like the mainstream consensus of Johannine experts. These are the women and men who are specialists in the Gospel of John, like their whole careers, have written major peer-reviewed monographs on John. They all say this, right? So Goodacre's point is not like Ehrman acts like it's just this Goodacre lone wolf. Oh, how dare he make this wild fringe argument? It's like, no, part of Goodacre's point is that, no, I'm actually in trend, right? Like, there's actually a bunch of us now. It's like growing. More and more experts are saying this. So I'm actually on trend. I'm not some fringer here. And this happened before. What was the other example? There was this idea that it was fringe. Well, even I think like the idea of like attacking Robin Faith Walsh on this same kind of argument, but really, like, she made the best case that kind of broke the wall essentially. But there's a bunch of scholars that are agreeing with her. Like, she's not a lone wolf, like making some sort of fringe position. And you could point that out to a lot of these people that they accuse of being fringers, making lone wolf arguments. Is actually, if you read their books, you'll see that they're pointing out that tons of scholars agree with them already. And that's what I do in the Docetism chapter, and with the section of Gnosticism as well. My position has ended up now the new mainstream position. It's all moved in that direction. And so, yeah, if you're not keeping up with the literature, you won't know that. And so you'd be like Bart Ehrman here and act like Goodacre's some lone wolf. Let's dismiss him. And a prime example is this when Ehrman attacked me for saying that Jesus was a divine being from the early high Christology. He attacked me for advocating early high Christology, that Jesus was actually an angelic figure, etc. And then, of course, but because he thought but even though I was like just repeating a mainstream position, he didn't know that was the mainstream position. And so when he actually he actually bothered for whatever reason to actually read one of these books. I can't remember who it was, Grecian, I think, somebody. And they said, this is actually a good argument. And then he writes a whole book about this is great and true. And like, Jesus was totally an incarnate pre-existent angel from the very beginning. It's like, any apologies? Because you were like ragging on me for being incompetent for saying that like 2 years ago. What the hell happened, right? And that's an example of what you're talking about. He wasn't aware of the literature of his own field. By some accident, he actually picked up one of these books and read it, and realized, it's not fringers. It's actually argument from prestige. It's someone from who has a university position that I can't disrespect. Did it? Oh, then it must be okay for me to think this. And now suddenly he thinks it, and he's completely fixed his position in our favor, right? Now, what I do in Obsolete Paradigm is I show like overwhelming consensus is early high Christology, like all the studies, like fucking all of them. And there's a lot of them, like a lot in the last 10 years are all hammering this. No, early high Christology, fuck yeah. And tons of evidence, whole monographs on this. And so, yeah, Ehrman's now on the right side of history, but I was there first and he was attacking me for being there. But even when I wrote, there were already multiple studies from mainstream scholars taking that position, as he found out eventually when he read one. But yeah, he does this a lot where he's not aware of the literature in the field. I actually find this a lot in the field. There's a lot of scholars just assume that because they have a PhD in the subject that they must therefore magically know all the literature on every particular subject. And then they're like shocked and surprised when I show them 10 studies that show them that they're wrong about something. It's like, why didn't you check? Like isn't that the thing that you were supposed to be taught to get your PhD is you always check, right? So like, well, where is the literature on this? Where is the field on this? Let me check Google Scholar or the ATLA database. Let's see what the latest arguments are. And then you go, oh, wow, the field's really moved from where I was told, 10, 20, 30 years ago. Then you would have an informed position. You'd say, well, here's what the field is arguing. There's a lot of studies on this, and they're all heading in this direction. And then maybe I should go and check to see if this checks out. And then you would do it, and then you would be informed, and then you would have an informed opinion that people could trust. But instead, what they do is they don't check the literature. They just make assertions from the armchair based on their confidence that they must have been taught correctly 20 years ago in their whatever PhD program they're in, which is so ass backwards as to how you're supposed to act as a historian. It's just, I don't understand it. Like, why, like, this is precisely the behavior that should have been trained out of you in your PhD program. Like, the one thing they taught you, never fucking do this. Always check the literature. Always make sure you're informed. See where the status of things is. Check the best arguments, pro and con. Like, be informed before you declare an opinion on something. Don't just armchair it and then ride on your prestige of your PhD or professorship or whatever. And I find this, Ehrman's not the only one to do this. There are other scholars doing this. And it's not only, but predominantly a biblical studies problem. And even when it shows up in other fields, the people that do it get laughed at by their colleagues because, as you get like the states' rights, the sort of lost cause historians, and, like there's other fields, like there were the anti-Marxist primitive economists about ancient Rome. And I wrote a whole blog about this, how they were so wrong and they just weren't keeping up on the literature to the point that like people who were up on the literature were laughing at them. Like, you're just not aware of the field. Like, the field has completely moved on. We have tons of evidence refuting everything you just said is the case. Why didn't you check the literature? Like, how are you relying on literature that's like 20, 30, 50 years old and not keeping up on the current literature on the field? And that happened there. And so but the reaction of the field was really that these guys are, they're past it, rather than, oh my God, we should respect this opinion. That's not what's going on in other historical fields. And biblical studies are more caught up in prestige over evidence than other fields are, I think.
Yeah, I was going to ask, do you think that the way that is handled, do you think that extends to seminary and divinity schools? Because like that would be the main difference.
Yeah, I don't know. I have speculated because I see the trend. It is true that there is a trend that all these guys, Bart Ehrman's one of them, who came up through Christian apologetics, right? So they went through schools that were Christian apologetics programs, not history programs, right? So they're specifically defend the faith programs. So like, which is even worse than seminary, right? Like seminary, like a Catholic seminary will give you more devil's advocacy so that they won't hide things from you and they don't really just engineer the thing to just hardcore defend the faith, fuck everything else, right? It's there's more methodology at the Catholic seminaries, right? And certainly in like the more mainline liberal seminaries. So you get like Episcopalian or Presbyterian and certain Presbyterian, I know conservative and liberal Presbyterians, but there are certain wings where you get more academic treatment versus apologetic treatment. But the more conservative you get, the more closer to like Liberty University kind of behavior, or what was it? Wheeler, is that where, I can't remember where Ehrman went, which is very conservative. Those go more towards the apologetical method. And I noticed that all the scholars that were trained up in the apologetical system versus the secular system, they all act like apologists, even now when they're atheists. So they still use the same arguments that apologists use, thinking that must be a correct way to argue, when in fact it's a completely fallacious way to argue. So it's like they don't know that they were mistrained in how to think and argue. They actually think that they were correctly trained, and they still use these methodologies, even against Christianity, but they're still fallacious methodologies because those are the methods that they were taught, and they're faulty methods. So they're not the methods you get taught in like mainstream history departments. And so I have noticed that there is a sort of correlation between these scholars, even when they're secular, when they were trained up in apologetics, they tend to be less reliable because they're so soaked and convinced of these apologetical approaches to things that they think that that's the correct way to argue. And they don't know that that's not an acceptable way to argue. And other fields of history would not allow that kind of argumentation. So yeah, there is that trend. So it could be that there's a sort of disparity that's already happening at the seminary / religious school level of this. But obviously there's no way to know. I mean, it would be a monumental feat to actually try and find out what's actually being taught in all these schools.
Yeah. We did get another super chat in Krokov, who says, could the lost scripture mentioned in Matthew 2:23 be actually a pesherim of the Septuagint version of Judges 13:5? You shall conceive and bear a son, the child shall be a Nazarite.
Yes. There's actually a lot of possibilities, not necessarily a pesherim. It could have just been an alternate reading of that scripture. Because we know for a fact that the scriptures then, so their manuscripts of Judges said different things than our manuscripts of Judges today. And it could also be that it could be a document that's riffing on Judges that's not in the canon. It could be a Targum of Judges, which is an Aramaic paraphrase of Judges. And we know those paraphrases were very loose. So there's a lot of possibilities there. I talk about that and cite some of the scholarship on it in Proving History. I have a whole section on Nazarites or the Nazorian thing. I also have it on the Historicity of Jesus. I can't remember if the source lists are the same, or if all the sources are on the Historicity, or if there's stuff in Proving History that's not on the Historicity. I can't remember, but I also talk about it on the Historicity of Jesus, where I mention these. But I think I do the most detail of this in Proving History, where I talk about this as one of the possibilities. And lots of scholars talk about this. You're not out in left field here. This is mainstream literature you're in agreement with. There's actual scholars who've really genuinely argued this. There are other possibilities, and it could be a combination of them. It could be any one of them. We don't really know. The only thing that I would say that we do know, and this is something that a lot of scholars would deny, but I think we know it, is that Matthew's not lying. There's absolutely no reason that he would make this up. So when Matthew says that it fulfilled a scripture, literally the only reason he would say that is if he was sure it was correct, that there was some scripture that he knew for a fact said that. Otherwise, it would be stupid for him to claim it, because people would immediately show that that's not the case, right? There's no such scripture. What are you talking about? So I think it's absolutely the case. We're very confident that Matthew actually is looking at some scripture, whether it's a different manuscript of Judges, whether it's Judges that he's sort of spinning, whether it's a Pesher in Judges, whether it's a Targum of Judges, whether it's some other apocryphal text that they're treating as scripture, because we know from the Dead Sea Scrolls that they were treating a lot more texts as scripture than we have now. We can't answer that question, but I talk about all the evidence for this, the scholarship on this idea of that these sort of quotations of Bible verses that don't exist. We have this in Clement as well. First Clement quotes a Bible verse that we have no freaking idea where the hell he's getting this scripture, but he calls it scripture anyway. He's getting it from somewhere, right? So I talk about all the scholarship on where these sort of mystery verses come from and all the different options. I think it's element 5, somewhere around element 5 in chapter 4 of On the Historicity of Jesus, where I go into all these options I just mentioned and the scholarship that talks about these different options. And examples of them. So we have lots of examples of these. The manuscript said different things than we have. We have a lot of evidence of that. A lot of examples of their manuscripts saying different things than our manuscripts, and that being an issue even then. So anyway, yeah, there's a lot of different ways to answer that, but that's a plausible theory. I don't know if it's the correct theory or not, but I would definitely give it respectability as one of the contenders.
All right. So that was the end of that section right there. The next part that we're going to cover, and going to try to cover it quick because we are about an hour and a half in.
Yeah,
right. There's this section here that is discussing how the gospel writers learned how to write in Greek. Okay, and it struck me as a bit odd, and I'm wondering what you think about it there, Ray.
Yeah, I'm curious about this. I haven't seen this, so let's do it.
Okay.
I suppose another argument that they make is that anyone who was at this level of literacy in Greek, or in other words, was able to compose in Greek, had learned to do that through an educational system that encouraged people to take stories and to basically riff on them, to write extrapolated versions of them, and that this is what the gospel writers are doing. How would you respond to that?
I think that was part of the educational system, but it wasn't the entire educational system. I don't know how well read they are in educational systems in antiquity. The world expert is Raphael Cribiori, who's written a number of very important books about it. And that is indeed something that people learned when they got advanced rhetorical education. But, we also have historians who are trained in Greek writing, and they're not, that's not how they're working at all. I mean, read Plutarch, read Suetonius, read Livy. That's not what they're doing. And so I don't know how familiar they are with these other authors, but I mean, there's certainly authors who are recording things that happened in the past that aren't just.
I think that it's a little disingenuous of Ehrman here to compare the gospel writers to Plutarch and Livy and like all these other, more advanced, like, because it's my understanding that the Greek that the gospels were written in was not as sophisticated as some of these more advanced writers like Plutarch
but also Plutarch does do this. So for Ehrman to just say they don't do this, they never do this. No, they do it a lot. Like Josephus even does it. Like Josephus does mimetic emulations of stuff, particularly the scriptures, where he makes his own stories up and even calls them stories that he's making up, or calls them mythos, where he does exactly that. And no, it's clear. It really annoys me when he cites Cribiori. Cribiori was my instructor, my graduate student instructor at Columbia. I took ancient education with her. That's where I learned all of this from her, right? And so she would totally take him to school on this. So not only that, but my dissertation advisor at Columbia was William Harris, who wrote the definitive book on Roman literacy. And so she wrote the definitive book on Roman education. He wrote the definitive book on Roman literacy. And those are my two main advisors at Columbia. So this is where I was at the feet of these people. And so it's annoying for me to use him, cite her name as if somehow she supports what he's saying. That's not exactly what he said, but he kind of was trying to trade on her prestige here. In fact, she said the opposite. So Cribiori, the stuff is Harris, Hetzer. So Catherine Hetzer recently did literacy in ancient Palestine, where she extends their information to the Palestinian case. But then there's a lot of others too. Thomas Brody has a whole section in his I can't remember the name of it, his book on the New Testament, the thing that he does the Gospel of Luke primarily in. That book, he has a whole 30 pages on the ancient education system. Dennis MacDonald has a whole section on this in several of his books, but even in his original, the Gospel of Mark, Homer and the Gospel of Mark has a section on this. And also there's other scholars. So I cite an author on the Creai, so Chreai, Creai, or maybe I can't remember. Anyway, so something like that. You got enough there. You can look that up in the index on the historicity of Jesus, where I cite the scholars talking about the Creai, because we actually have the school exercises. This is the thing: is we have these exercises. We have ancient authors talking about the education system and what was taught in them. So we have, for instance, with early educational authors and later educational authors, multiple authors talk about this kind of stuff. And so we've got all of this information. So we have the actual papyri with the school exercises. We've got authors about the education, and we find these kinds of mimetic materials, the way that they tell stories and invent stories to tell messages. Parables, right, is essentially what Christians would call them. They're called Creai in the Greek context. But yeah, the evidence for this is overwhelming. And to the point that what Harris and Cribiori have pointed out is that to be compositionally competent, in other words, to be a composer of stories, the way the authors of the Gospels are, that the only time you get taught that is at the equivalent of graduate school, which is exactly when you're taught all these techniques for making up stories, right? Like it's almost all you're taught. Like you read a bunch of historians, like you read Isocrates and you read Herodotus and things like that. But then you're told there's school exercises. They're all making stuff up. And your whole objective is to do that. And we have there's authors on the Mara Bar Serapion letter, and there's been a bunch of scholarship on that in the last 10 years, and I cited all in Obsolete Paradigm. But key to that is that the authors now that are doing the new studies of Mara Bar Serapion are using this educational literature to point out that the Mara Bar Serapion letter is one of these school exercises, that it's actually a 4th century Christian school exercise that someone was doing as basically like their college essay, right? Is it they're told to like make up a story, and then they made up the story using the techniques that they were taught, and it was never even meant to be taken seriously as a real letter. And so anyway, we've got tons of evidence of this. It's clear Ehrman knows none of this, which I don't understand how he does not know any of this, or maybe he does and he just wants to deny it all, like he does with Goodacre. It's not clear to me. But it's unmistakable that the authors of the Gospels were absolutely taught specifically how to make up stories. They were taught not only how to make up stories to tell a parable, to tell some sort of message, a gospel or whatever, but they were taught how to make up stories in the style of or of another author, or using a base text. Like, so tell a story about Hercules, except he meets Alexander the Great, and what happens? And it's a moral about cleaning your bed or something, right? Like, I'm making that up, but they have these school exercises where making it up was the whole point, and to make it sound convincing was the whole point, and to emulate other literature was the whole point, right? But at the same time, not copying the literature, because that was gauche. Like, you sucked at your job if you just copied. You have to like write in your own words, but make it sound like something that Plutarch would write or something like that. So yeah, absolutely. There's no way the gospel authors were not massively trained to do this. So that adds further support that it's not surprising that that's what we find them doing, is that they're doing exactly the thing that they're taught to do. And this is also in Walsh. Walsh cites a lot of these authors and a lot of these same points that I just made. So anyways, a lot of these scholars have pointed this out. They're all ancient education scholars are against Bart Ehrman here. So anyway, yeah, that's the state of the field. And it just irks me when he like throws away Cribiori's name when like, if she was here, she'd be like, no, I'm not letting you get away with that. But people can read her stuff. She's written several books on this subject.
Yeah. And I feel like this is just more evidence of him being out of touch, like with the field in general.
Yeah.
And so it's like when he says statements like, oh, a majority of people don't believe this, so therefore it's not true, or something like that, I feel like people should be questioning that.
Yeah. Also, I think he was kind of like lazily armchairing right here when he said, well, that's not how everyone was educated, or he threw something like that out there. What all of these authors I just mentioned do, like Cribiori, Harris and stuff, is that they prove that there absolutely was no other education system. So there is no other, like there's none, right? So like, even if you're Jewish, if you're writing in Greek, you went to the same schools and were taught the same things. In fact, one of the points that Cribiori makes is that there was no variability and no change in the education system for about 1,000 years. So there was no alternative education system. And when I do in science education, I should have mentioned that. So science education in the early Roman Empire, I summarize a lot of the school stuff. I don't go so much into this stuff, the literary art side of it, but I go into what the schools were, what levels taught what things, who went to these schools, etc. So I cover all that, and I focus on the science content, but I talk about the whole content so that you have a framework to understand the science content. But I have a whole section in there about this point, is that there's, at the grad school level, which is the composition level, there is no other model. There's no other school you can go to. And that this was such a problem for the Christians. The Christians had a problem that they didn't like the heavy pagan content of these schools, but they couldn't learn compositional Greek without going to these schools. And what experts on ancient Christian education point out is that the early Christians never thought to invent their own schools. So, and there weren't Jewish schools they could go to that taught Greek composition. There weren't special Christian schools they could go to. They had to go to the same damn schools that taught the same damn things, right? And they were wringing their hands over this. There's a problem. Like, is it moral? Can I get an education to compose in Greek because I have to study all this pagan stuff? And they're like, woe is us, but it's the lesser of all evils or whatever. Like, they have all this moral argument about it. But the one thing that never occurs to them is to even make their own schools, which means they didn't have them yet, right? And so they don't invent their own schools until the 4th century. And that really starts under Constantine, actually. So yeah, right. So there just was no other school. So yeah, Ehrman is wrong. It wasn't like some people went to different schools or learned different things. No, it's the exact same skill set, exact same learning program, the exact same stages. It's all the same. And in fact, peculiarly so. This is what all the education authors point out for the Roman Empire, is that it was oddly very stable and universal.
Yeah. And we got a little bit more in this section here, but yeah, I totally think that he seems to be out of touch in this area.
Making stuff up.
And so could we? I'm still playing devil's advocate. Could we say that it's at least possible that Mark is basically the core, and everyone else is basically riffing on Mark? I mean, it's at least possible. Yeah.
Well, I don't know what would make it impossible. No, I don't think anybody says it's impossible.
Sure. Okay. You would say,
but history is not a matter of deciding if history is a matter of establishing probabilities.
Sure. Yeah.
And so for a probability to be a probability, of course, it first has to be a possibility. But the fact that something is possible doesn't make it probable. And so to decide what's probable, you have to look for evidence. You can't just say, well, the other person has no evidence, so I'm right.
And this is something I find ethicists do a hell of a lot. They come up with something as a possibility, decide that they like that possibility because it helps them reach the conclusion they want, and then argue ferociously that that's the only possible possibility.
Yeah, that's a straw man. But this is actually a good point, because they're confusing modal with empirical arguments. This happens a lot. And so I have a whole section in Obsolete Paradigm about this. I think it's in my chapter on the seed of David. It's in one of the last 3 chapters, where I go into this very point that there's a difference between modal arguments, which is where possibility is enough to defeat the argument, and empirical arguments where you need a probability to defeat a possibility. And so I talk about they're confusing the two, first of all. And then again, they're confusing you need it to be probable, but that goes both ways. It looks like Ehrman almost gets this, that you both need evidence for it to be probable. When neither of you have evidence that it's probable, it's 50-50, which means you don't know, right? So so it seems like he can't get there to understand that there's a state where it's 50-50. If it's 50%, it's neither probable nor improbable, right? So if it's 50%, then you can't do anything with that. If it's 50% chance it's historical versus made up, well, we're done. We just have to cast that out as unusable because we can't determine which is more probable. And then all the rest, we have evidence, and all the evidence goes only one way, and it's not Ehrman's way. And so that's the thing they're not doing. And so when O'Neill gets annoyed by mythicists supposedly making this argument, now I don't know what mythicists he's talking about. Maybe there's some dumb amateur internet mythicists he argued with. He's a bad faith arguer, so I don't trust his account of what someone has told him, right? So I don't know what argument he's referring to. It might have been a really good argument and he just completely strawmanned it in his head and got it wrong. I don't know. So I don't know what he's talking about. But if we're going to talk about mainstream, peer-reviewed, not internet rando stuff, but actual published scholarship that actually did pass the bar for the field, is not self-published kind of stuff. That is On the Historicity of Jesus and Questioning the Historicity of Jesus by Lataster, right? So it's my book and Lataster's book. And then, of course, all the scholarship we cite, but those are the two. So if you want to find us making this possibility argument that O'Neill thinks is invalid, find one in our books, point it out, show us this claim. You're claiming we're making this invalid argument. Where is it? And what I think would happen is if he would, now he will never do that because he's a disingenuous bad faith actor and doesn't really care to read any of this stuff and doesn't care about any of this. He really doesn't care about truth or logic or any of that. So I don't expect he'll ever do this. But if he does, what I would expect he would do is just search for the word possible or possibility and say, oh, here's an example without reading it, right? So here's an example where you make this argument. It's oh, okay. Now let's see. Is that a modal argument or is that an empirical argument? Oh, you don't know the difference? Well, okay, I'm gonna have to teach you how logic works. When possibility, there's sometimes a possibility is enough to refute an argument, but it's only in a particular case that succeeds. And I talk about when that is. It's when modal arguments are the thing being debated. In an empirical argument, yeah, you need a probability. But there's other ways where you're talking about as a possibility, we're talking it's 50-50. That's a different argument from merely possible. Where I think Ehrman is confusing here. Possibility is, 1 in a million chance is at least possible, but who believes that? He's confusing that with a 50-50 case where it's equally possible. Either option is equally possible. Those are not the same cases, but in his head, it looks like Ehrman is confusing and conflating those two cases. And so that there's a lot of errors here in terms of logic of probability. And so when Ehrman makes this case that, well, we're historians, we argue probability. Well, probability is mathematical. So does that mean Bart Ehrman has taken the trouble to learn the mathematics of probability theory? No, we know that. So Ehrman doesn't really himself believe that historians himself are really making probability arguments because he doesn't believe in learning anything about probability. He doesn't do any of that. And I've taken him to task for making basic errors in probability theory before. And he gets angry when I point that out. Like rather than realizing, oh shit, I probably should learn something about probability logic since my entire field is literally about probability logic. No, he just gets angry when we suggest that you need to learn probability logic, and that's kind of a ridiculous way to react to that fact.
Yeah, and in that particular section, as far as what kind of really irked me about what he said, is that crap. I just had it and then I lost it.
Oh no! I hate it when that
I'm
happens.
sure. Yeah, I know. I'm sure it'll come back to me. Oh no, I remember now. I remember. The thing that really bothers me, and I think it's just because like I know I've only got a math minor, like as far as my bachelor's goes, but it really bothers me how Ehrman's like, well, you need a probability for that, but then he refuses to do the work to establish the probability. It feels like he just uses the word probability in order to give him some kind of like credibility when he's talking about it, but he never establishes any kind of probability.
Right. Like what probability? How are you getting that probability? How does one derive a probability from evidence at all? Like what even is the logical relationship between evidence and probability logically? Like how do you get from evidence to a probability? Like he can't even explain that to you. Like he doesn't know how to do that. He says, well, I just feel it in here in my gut. I just feel it. It just feels, right? It's all feels, which is not valid, right? Like you can't rely on your feelings because your feelings can be wrong. You really need to, like, if you're going to talk about deriving probabilities from evidence, you need to know how you derive a probability from evidence. And then, like you point out, you have to actually derive a probability from evidence. And even when historians do this correctly, it was still with hand-waving vagueness. They don't use numbers, but they talk about more probable or most probable or whatever. But even when they do it correctly, where they present evidence, they make a case, and then they say, therefore, probably this, it's always Bayesian. And when they do it incorrectly, they would know it was incorrect if they understood that correct arguments have to be Bayesian. And so his refusal to learn like Bayes' theorem, which is the fundamental architecture of all probability reasoning about facts and empirical facts, right? For his refusal to do that and think that it's absurd that you have to do that is why he never learns this. And I'm not the only person who's pointed this out about historians generally. I opened my chapter on this in chapter 5 in Obsolete Paradigm, quoting David Hackett Fisher, who has a big complaint about historians not doing this. Like, it's like, this is a serious problem in the field. No one's fixing it. This is really annoying. We need to stop acting this way. We need to solve this problem. And so there are other historians who've documented and pointed out that history, and it's not just this field, there are other fields that also, historians in other fields don't know how to do this. They don't they just still relying on gut feelings and sort of like impressions they've gotten and standards they've learned, heuristics and things, but they don't really know how to derive a probability from evidence. And that's a history-wide problem. It's not just a biblical studies problem. And that's what David Hackett Fisher points out, and that's what I've pointed out. And there are other historians. I cite numerous others. One of the things that's happened in the last 10 years is there have been many historians, including historians in biblical studies, who've really been impacted by my book, Proving History, and say, yeah, he's onto something here. This is what we need to be doing, and then have actually used that method in other subjects, right? So, and I cite the bibliography of the historians doing this and so on in Obsolete Paradigm. So that's a trend, but it's only a few people that are like on it, because I think most historians as humanities majors are terrified of math, so they don't want it to be true that they have to learn math, because it's easier if they can just go on with their gut feelings and mutual circle jerks or whatever as to how to get probabilities from evidence. The thing is though, like in most fields of history, even Roman history, but even ancient history is problematic because the evidence is scant. But even in Roman history, you usually have a lot better evidence than you have for early Christianity. But in other fields, you have vast, overwhelming evidence, so that you never have to think about what the probability is, because the evidence is so overwhelming for a position that even if you were to work out the math, it would be a ridiculous number. It's just obvious that if you did the math, it would be a ridiculous number. So you never need the math, right? That's the thing is, like, I think this is one of those magical things where Ehrman wants the magic to rub off from like early American history. He wants it to rub off onto ancient history, that because we have overwhelming data for early 20th century history and therefore historians don't need to do math to get highly probable conclusions because the evidence is so overwhelming, that he wants to magically rub that off onto the weak, shitty evidence that we have for early Christianity. And that doesn't work. When you're dealing with weak, shitty evidence, you don't have that safety position of overwhelming evidence where the probabilities, you don't even have to do the math. It would be a waste of time to do the math because it's so obvious that the ratios are enormous, millions, billions to one. Like there's no way to even, you don't even have to do the math. But when you're talking about super sketchy, scant evidence, you have to do the math because it's so close, such a close call that it's highly susceptible to bias, right? And so to control for your like feels and the biases in your fields, to control for that, you need to actually take seriously the actual mathematics to like work it out to see what the tolerances really are objectively, and whether your feelings really have a justification or not. So he's doing the same thing where he wants like the reliability of modern history to rub off magically onto ancient history, and that's just not what happens. So you really have to be more interested in mathematical methodology when you're dealing with like early Christian history than when you're doing with like early 20th century history. And that's why. But I don't think he has any comprehension of this. And I don't get the impression he's ever read any text in historical methodology. That was actually one of my minor fields for my PhD. So I read a ton of historical methodology, modern and ancient. So I've got to where I am from doing that, right? So I know this kind of stuff. Anyways, yeah. So I think your intuition is correct there. That's part of the problem what's happening here.
Yeah. And interesting that you mentioned that something there right at the end, because we're going to be moving into the peer review section, where I feel like they're a bit contradictory here, because they're going to start out like basically lying about obsolete paradigm, and then they're going to go into something that's like, I feel like is gaslighting, but I'll let you listen.
Okay.
I suppose on that last point about, you can't trust what all these New Testament people are saying. Do you realize he's written a new book which didn't pass peer review, which he's very angry about, where he proves that Gnosticism didn't exist?
Well, Rick, I mean, it didn't pass peer review? I feel like it did.
It passed factual peer review, but yeah, no. O'Neill is a bad faith reporter, right? So he's not going to tell you the truth about anything. It failed peer review only on matters not having to do with the factual content of the book. So, and that's documented, and we've actually had it's multiply confirmed by other peer reviewers who peer review the peer reviews. So that's all a fact. I'll throw in the comments so the article where I talk about the peer review, and it links to the video I did with experts in the field who also peer reviewed the peer review. So you don't have to take my word for it. And of course, obviously I totally expect O'Neill to skip over all of that. Like he doesn't care about like the truth about what actually happened or what it even means to pass peer review or whatever. So that doesn't surprise me. What I'd be curious to know is what Ehrman has to say.
Yeah. And I just want everybody to really remember this, that O'Neill initially brings up, he wrote a new book that didn't pass peer review. So he's putting an importance on the peer
that's a
review
good point too. Yeah.
I was listening to your podcast, this morning about Gnosticism, but Richard Carrier has debunked it. So
you mean
you're wasted.
There's no such thing as Gnosticism?
No such thing. Yeah, no, there were no Gnostics.
Okay.
I just thought, let's put that out there.
See, again, I feel like this is reinforcing my point that he's out of touch with the field. And I probably because he's just set in his ways or whatnot. I mean, I don't look at my field every single day as to what new thing has come along. But it's like if you're going to sit there and be like, oh, it's been disproven. I feel like, at least in his realm, like he should at least be knowledgeable on the advancements that's going on.
So O'Neill, this is another good one. It also shows that neither of them have read Obsolete Paradigm either, because Ehrman doesn't even know what's in. Like he's surprised that this is even there, and O'Neill completely misdescribes what the chapter says. Right, so like O'Neill thinks that I disproved Docetism. Like he thinks that this is some chapter where I do this, when in fact what I do is I cite all the experts on Docetism in the last 10 years who do this. So they did it. The entire field of entire specialty of Docetism, all the scholars in the specialized field of Docetism, all of them did this. So all I'm doing is reporting what they did, right? And then I'm reinforcing it by going through so what they do is they point out that Docetism didn't exist. So we have to reinterpret these passages. And so then what I do is I say, well, we can do that if we take mythicism as the model. And so then I apply mythicism to their results. So I'm not the one proving that Docetism didn't exist. That was already done by the entire field of Docetism studies in the last 10 years. So it wasn't me. But O'Neill is telling Ehrman as if I did this, like a lone wolf who did this. And then Ehrman is like, surprised, I didn't know this, which illustrates, this is a good example. So one of the reasons the peer reviewers said not to publish my book is that it said nothing new and said nothing that would be of interest to scholars in the field. Okay, so, and that's almost word for word. And it wasn't because there was any factual errors. It wasn't because there were any methodological errors. There are no specific errors of fact that they found in the book. It was just because it says nothing new and scholars won't be interested. Notice how here, Ehrman, a notable, reputable scholar in the field, did not know the entire contents, that the entire field of Docetism studies has made this shift. He didn't know that. So clearly it's new to him and therefore interesting to him, right? So like what the peer reviewer said is that chapter and all the other chapters, that chapter is not new and there's nothing interesting. And Ehrman has just refuted the peer reviewers, that he said it's clearly to him new and clearly would be interesting to him, therefore, to find out that the entire field has gone there. That's where the field is. And all I do is react to where the field is. And so O'Neill has completely misrepresented the chapter to Ehrman, and Ehrman took the bait and sort of just armchaired this and acted like he knows about Docetism studies when he's now exposing the fact that he knows nothing about Docetism studies in the last 10 years, because that was what my chapter did, is to update people on the status of Docetism studies in the last 10 years. So what you're seeing here is the entire thing that we've been talking about in illustration, where Ehrman is not keeping up with his studies. O'Neill is not a good faith describer of anything I've argued. And so he's just circle jerking these guys. These guys are circle jerking each other over this sort of mythical account of what I did in chapter 7 of Obsolete Paradigm. And this, in the process, illustrating that O'Neill is a liar and Ehrman doesn't know what he's talking about. And that's the whole big problem with the internet. O'Neill represents the sort of pseudo-intellectuals on the internet, where they're fucking liars, don't know what they're talking about. And then Ehrman is representing this sort of out-of-touchness, where he doesn't know where Docetism studies is. He's not kept up with it. And he's being misled by O'Neill, so O'Neill's like lying to him. So Ehrman is kind of just trusting O'Neill, his account, that somehow this is something I alone argued. I'm the lone wolf arguing this. But by trusting him, that Ehrman is exposing the fact that he doesn't know what I document, and that in fact I'm just following the field. And Ehrman's the one who's the fringe outsider now. And so he doesn't know that. And so this illustrates everything we've been talking about this whole video. So I think that's a really good example.
Yeah.
Oh, I can't get my comments to post. I don't know why. I don't know what's preventing me. So I'm going to put... you got a link right there. I'll get it in the chat as well as in the I just threw it in private chat. So the
thing.
one I threw in private chat is the article about the book. And there's a section there about the peer review, and there's a link to a video where for like several hours, me and a few other experts who read all the peer reviews so they can comment. So you don't have to take my word for what I say there. You get like independent expert reviews of the reviews in that video. So it's all documented, is what I just said, basically, that the reviewers didn't actually factually review the book. They just came up with bogus political reasons to nix it. And it had a bunch of like stupid apologetical nonsense in there too, but you can get that from the video. But anyway, yeah, so that's the reality here. I don't expect Ehrman to know that, because he doesn't give a shit about this kind of stuff. So he never reads my blog. He doesn't care about anything that I say. He doesn't care whether what O'Neill is saying is true or not. Like, he just believes him. But nothing I can do about that. But for those who actually care, there is a breadcrumb with evidence to follow regarding this. It's not just me making stuff up. I'm also going to throw up another item.
Well, if so Rick, if you'll just make a comment in the live stream, then I can mod you and you can throw.
Oh,
up the
okay.
link
So I did. I threw two comments up in there, but let me do it again. And there it is. So it's sitting there grayed out.
Oh, I was gonna say without if you make a comment without a link, then I can mod you and then you can put the
okay.
link in.
All right. Okay. There we go. Wait, that's not a word. I'm trying to type over my microphone. So there we go.
Hi, there you go. All right. And
Now,
then
will the link go? Or will
No, hold on, I gotta add you as a moderator.
Oh, I see. I see.
All right.
That way,
Yeah,
way, no one litters the comments with links. Okay, yeah, very good.
Yeah. You should be able to post it now. There you go.
Now getting a wrench. Did it go? There it goes. All right. So there's that's what the wrench means. Okay. Yeah. So that's the link to the article about the book. But also important. Let me make sure. Where is it? Here we go. I'm going to put another link in. We're not going to have time to go into it on this stream, but I'm going to throw another link in that goes to a comment. And that it's in the Bart Ehrman recap article, but there's a comment down there where I comment on their video, the O'Neill Ehrman one. I didn't watch the video. I just watched one section that someone said, hey, I think they might have caught an error you made in your book there. And said, oh, okay, well, that's important. I wanted to go check that to make sure I corrected it or whatever. The long story short on that is that I didn't make a mistake, except insofar as I vaguely worded things so that it misled them. I think Ehrman, as a grammaticist, should not have been misled, but that's an interpretive case. I'll just grant that maybe he was just confused because he got blindsided by O'Neill with this and was confused by the wording because he didn't read the context. He didn't know what it was about. But anyway, I have a errata now that in my errata page on the historicity of Jesus that corrects the wording so that to forego that mistake, to prevent people from making a mistake. They just misread what I was saying. And then when you understand what I was actually saying, there's no error actually. And so for people who are interested in that one moment, which we haven't gotten to, it's not going to come up in today's live stream, but it's a moment where they're reading page 590 of my book. And they think like they're referring to things that exist in Paul's letters that aren't there. And that's actually not what I'm saying, but they're just misreading the book. But for people who want to catch up on that, you want to see what actually happened there. That's the link that will help you. It has links and descriptions that will help you out. And so I threw that link in so people can find that on there. But let's continue with what clips that you've brought to see what we've got.
Yeah, I was going to make sure that I brought up that part because I know that was kind of important for you to mention there. Sorry if the rain, we got a storm coming through or something right now. So I don't know if you can hear it.
We have rain here too. It's actually been raining, not stormy, but still. But no, I don't hear it on your audio, so you're good.
Okay, good. Yeah, so we got a little bit more in this. I think we're only going to get through this peer review thing, try to get through that. And I'll be sure to bring up the that misunderstanding there at the end again as well.
Okay.
There's no such thing as Jews either, apparently. Or maybe there's no such things as Romans. I don't know. What makes you think there are Romans?
Yeah. Well, anyway, Richard Garriott strikes again. So there's a couple of other questions.
There are plenty of people who think that Gnosticism is too broad of a term and that you can't, that it's too broad to cover.
Wait, why did he suddenly go to Gnosticism? Did Ehrman mishear O'Neill?
Maybe. Because, it started out as Docetism and now it's Gnosticism.
Now he's talking Gnosticism. I mean, Gnosticism didn't exist. That's another, and that's not me saying it. That's the entire Jesus seminar is now saying that. And I also talk about that and cite all the scholars. It's where the scholars are now. It's the mainstream consensus on Gnosticism studies that Gnosticism is also an accidental modern construct. It wasn't a thing. But it wasn't a thing in a different way than Docetism wasn't a thing. Anyway, so all of this I cover with the citations of scholarship and quotations of experts like Karen King and so on. That's all in Obsolete Paradigm. So, but that surprised me. He suddenly switched to Gnosticism. I would be shocked if he hadn't heard about the Westar Institute report on Gnosticism, because that was a big deal in the field. Mm-hmm. So maybe his brain found that in his memory and has sort of switched tracks to Gnosticism. But anyway, I don't know why he suddenly switched to Gnosticism here, because O'Neill did not cue that. But
yeah, I was a little taken aback by him trying to compare Gnosticists or Docetists to the Romans.
Because he said hyperbole. Yeah.
How do you prove that Romans existed?
Okay. That's a fair critique. I was being charitable and saying he's just being funny, right? He's being hyperbolic, and I don't think he's I think he knows he's being hyperbolic. I think the error is that he doesn't know these are actually mainstream shifts in the field. Not his hyperbole. I mean, his hyperbole, I think he would admit, was hyperbole. But yeah.
I guess I'm just I'm taking him a bit too literally, because
Right.
in my mind
I'm
like,
a little
how does that
charitable here.
compare? That's not a fair
right.
comparison.
No, you're right. It doesn't. And I think if you like were to push him on that, he would admit, okay, I was a little of extreme of an analogy. I was being flippant. But it would be a valid like joke if O'Neill's account of things were true, and so Ehrman is relying on O'Neill's account of things. So if it was just me, this lone wolf in a supposedly non-peer-reviewed book, making this argument out of the blue and all by myself and whatever, like I could see Ehrman being like flippant about it. Like I would probably be flippant about it myself. Actually, I would be a little more respectful of the idea, because I say, well, that's kind of plausible. I'd have to see the argument, right? That would be my response, really, because that was my response originally back in when I did On the Historicity of Jesus. I was like, well, that's kind of plausible that it didn't exist, but I can't prove it, so I'm not convinced of it. So I had to be convinced by all the subsequent literature. But anyway, so yeah, I'm a little more charitable, I guess, in this case. But I think Ehrman is being misled by O'Neill, so it's really O'Neill's fault that what's going on here.
Yeah. Okay, let's continue.
I mean, but wow, okay.
We're going to have to wait until the book comes out, or not. A couple of other questions that people ask me to raise with you. I mean, one comes up quite often. It came up in one of my comments.
What does he mean by when the book comes out?
Obsolete Paradigm. I mean, he didn't know that it came out in November. I believe it was November 11th.
Yeah, this video is after that, right? Okay.
Yeah, November 29th is when.
How does he? I guess he knows because he read the. No, but if he'd read the article about it, he would know that it was out, because that's what the article's about. How does he know what's in chapter 7, but doesn't know the book is already out? I don't understand how that's even possible. It doesn't matter. This is a trivial complaint. Let's move on.
So on one of my videos, they say mythicists like Carrier and his friend Latasta have published peer-reviewed books detailing their case. Why won't historicists, so-called, like you, do the same? Why won't you publish a peer-reviewed book responding in detail to all of the mythicists' peer-reviewed arguments? Isn't that how scholarship works?
So I have to say, so I've been, I started getting deeply into scholarship probably 45 years ago or so, and I spend almost every day reading scholarship, and so I never hear scholars talk about that they've consulted an article that was peer reviewed, or that I have a peer reviewed book.
Yeah.
So I'm not quite sure why. It's only the mythicists I hear do that. I'm not quite sure what it means. I mean, why do they? Like this article you're just talking about on Galatians 1:19. It was published in 1975, 50 years ago, and the one article that Richard says supports his view. And no other, he apparently couldn't find other articles, but he did insist this is peer reviewed. And I'm wondering what he thinks that means, because I mean, I know what it means, but why does he keep saying that? Because when I write a scholarly book, I published a book a couple years ago with Yale University Press about journeys to the afterlife that are narrated in Greek, Roman, Jewish, and Christian.
All right, before we continue with this, I feel like this is a bit gaslighting, because we were never the ones, or at least my understanding of the discussion, we were never the ones, the mythicists, never the ones that made a big deal about peer review. It was always the historic. Yeah,
it was our opponents. Yeah, they're always saying, "Well, you've never passed peer review. This is a bogus thing. You don't have no reason to take it seriously." I did this. I was a historicist saying that's never passed peer review, so it's bullshit. Like I was one of these guys. That's how big that was the mainstream thing. And so when they would always say "Oh, that's just internet shit," or "That's just self-published," or "That's," they would say this about Robert Price, none of his stuff is peer-reviewed, it's just published with whatever publisher, it's a biased publisher or whatever. They're not peer-reviewing his stuff, it's not official or whatever. So they would dismiss it constantly. There's no peer-reviewed version of this. They did this, and Ehrman himself did this. So I don't he's got a very short memory, because if you go all the way back, he was doing this exactly the same thing. And I put this out, and I think one of the articles I linked to in Ehrman Recap, where he's making this point is well, these guys have never passed peer review. This theory's never passed peer review. It's an amateur outsider theory, etc. Okay, so what we do, they make this complaint over and over again for years and years and years. I was even part of this. And then we finally get shit published under peer review. And they still go around saying, well, that's never passed peer review. Well, actually, yes, it has. It did. Did you not notice that this one's peer reviewed? Or then they'll go, well, look at like Arcaria S and Atwell. This is bullshit stuff. I was like, well, that didn't pass peer review. Our stuff did. So like, why don't we talk about the version that passed peer review, not the versions that didn't pass peer review? And they ignore us then, right? So like this, though, they're the ones who created this fucking peer review argument. And so all we're doing is continually reminding them of that. And then, of course, what their response to this is to forget that that ever happened. And why are you talking about peer review? That's silly. Why are you talking about peer review? It's like, you motherfuckers, you the fuckers made us talk about peer review. This is you. You did this. And so, yeah, they're the ones who set that bar. We met the bar, and then they moved the goalpost and say, well, peer review doesn't mean anything. Why are you even talking about peer review? Peer review is useless. Right? Like, that's basically the tack that Ehrman's saying is like, is past peer review, why do we care? It doesn't mean anything. But obviously it would. Like, if the argument I cited for, he's talking about Trudinger, if Trudinger was some internet rando, or even Robert Price, he didn't publish anything under peer review, no journal articles or books that I know of, he would hammer the shit out of this. Oh, that's just some, like, he's just writing outside the field. He's not met the standards of the field. He would say that, right? And so no. So now that I point out, it's like, actually, no. Now I actually don't say this. I don't actually say peer reviewed in the original thing. I just cite him. But when people like argue that, well, you don't have a peer reviewed source on this, I say, yes, I have Trudinger's peer reviewed source. So I'm responding to them, right? Like saying that there's no peer reviewed source. But here's the other thing. It's like, he says it's 1975, it's old or whatever. But the thing is it transformed multiple biblical translation committees. So their entire official Bible translations that are responding in agreement with Trudinger. There are entire commentaries on Galatians that agree with Trudinger. So for Ehrman to say that, oh, Trudinger's one peer-reviewed guy in 1975 doesn't mean anything. Fuck that. Let's skip that. Is, first of all, multiply disingenuous. First of all, it's like, so you're just going to dismiss Trudinger's argument. What now? Because peer review doesn't mean anything. Therefore, you don't have to pay attention to the argument. Like, is that what he's saying? But also, he's ignoring that multiple commentators agree with Trudinger. Even Trudinger's critic Howard agrees with Trudinger in the relevant sense. It's like whole Bible translation committees agree with Trudinger. So it's actually it's baked into like mainstream scholarship now. Trudinger was right, and he had that impact, right? And you could map out and show the impact that he had on the field. So if you're going to disagree with Trudinger, you can't just flippantly say peer review doesn't mean anything. I don't care if he wants to say now that he doesn't give a shit about peer review. That's fine. Let's hear your take on Trudinger's argument, right? So like, what do you actually think Trudinger argued? Do you agree with it, disagree with it? There's only one critic, Howard, and Howard actually confirms every relevant thing about Trudinger. In fact, Howard actually confirms my take on Trudinger, which I point out in Obsolete Paradigm. So like this kind of like suddenly, like you're saying, gaslighting us about the whole peer review debate, like the peer review debate that they started. And that now that we've beat them on that debate, they're claiming that was why are you talking about peer review? Like they're claiming that we didn't beat them. Like we never made that argument. What are you talking about? We don't care about peer review. Of course you fucking care about peer review. But for this to be that, and for the Trudinger thing, like maybe they get into it later. If you've got the clips and stuff where they go into it, maybe. Because it sounds like they do when they get to page 590, like they're trying to do that. Mm-hmm. But you got to deal with the argument, right? Like this whole like, oh, we can dismiss Trudinger because he's peer reviewed now, because it's 1975, so therefore it's no one agrees with him, I guess, even though there's tons of evidence to the contrary. But it just kind of pisses me off. And you're right, this is gaslighting. They're totally trying to they're forgetting. They're rewriting history as to why this is. They're like ignoring the reason that this is the argument. And I have to point out, like right wingers do this all the time, right? Like they're always talking about why are you liberals always talking about this, why, that, and the other? It's like, because you fucking were talking about it and we had to refute you. You forced us to pull that shit out. And now you're moving the goalpost and saying, oh, why are we constantly making a point out of it? No, you're the ones who made the point out of it, right? So it's the same kind of thing that you see in the political sphere, this kind of gaslighting about what the actual sequence of events was in terms of what the argumentation and the things we're talking about are. Ehrman's like falling right into that same dumb trap. It's kind of insulting, really.
Predates 1975. So.
Bart predates 1975.
I don't think his degrees do. I don't think his degrees do.
Yeah, no. So we're not going to be able to get to the Brothers of the Lord section tonight because I'm running out of time. But what he does do is he makes Trudinger out to be kind of like a singleton, like an off the wall outlier of interpret of reading Galatians 1:19 the way that
do they mention Howard? Do they talk about Howard?
I believe maybe I think that he might list him in the list, but it's still like oh yeah, there's a couple people that read it this way, but it's like a minority.
Right. That's not whole Bible translation committees, whole commentaries in Galatians. No, that's not a few people. But also that's another example of just dismissing the argument from prestige rather than let's actually pay attention to what the argument is. Right. So. And I think like they were trying to when they get to the page 590 stuff, they're trying like they're clearly new to this. They didn't check the literature. They haven't read Trudinger. They haven't actually read any of this. They're reading it for my book for the first time, and they're trying to like figure out what my argument is. They're trying to figure out what Trudinger's argument is rather than reading Trudinger. They're trying to figure it out from what I say, which is completely the incorrect way to do this as a scholar. Is well, let's go read Trudinger. Let's read Howard. Let's read Carrier's synthesis of Trudinger and Howard. Like that's how you would normally do this, but they're trying to apologetically make the argument go away with all these specious apologetics about he's just one guy, as if it's not possible for one guy to be right in this field, right? So anyway, so it's another example of not citing the opinions of people who've read the article and therefore know the argument and therefore have an informed opinion about the argument. They're citing people that never read the argument and don't care what it is and have an opinion anyway. And that's actually invalid consensus. That's not a valid consensus. But they treat it like it's valid. And so anyway, that's my take on that generally. I guess people can watch that section and compare what they say with what I just said. And more importantly, with what I say in the book. So you really do need to actually pay attention to what my actual argument is and actually read Trudinger. I think it's available online. I can't remember. I think there's a free version somewhere.
Yeah, it probably is. I remember, during like all of my research, I would go and try to look up the actual papers. I'm able to find most like just available freely online without having.
Yeah, and there's also I should point out people should be aware because we made the point about Ehrman was brought up in conservative apologetics training, that there is a dogmatic reason to not want Trudinger to be true. So there is a Christian dog in this race. And they don't want Trudinger, and that's why there's disagreements among translation committees among the Bible for the New Testament. There's particular dogmatic reasons that have nothing to do with history as to why Trudinger is dangerous. And I sense that Ehrman has no sense of the politics of why people are rejecting Trudinger. Sometimes overrides any like rational evidence-based reasoning. He should be sensitive to that, but he's not. And I think people should be aware that like when there's a dogmatic reason to be resistant, you should have your ears pricked up and red flags should be going. And you go, oh, okay, I need to pay more careful attention to this because there's bias here that I need to overcome. And that's why it's important to get into the actual grammar that Trudinger talks about. It's really crucial. And I talk about that in more detail in Obsolete Paradigm. I have a whole section on it for people who are interested in that.
Yeah. All right, let's see what else he has to say.
Traditions, and I talk a lot. I mention a lot of scholarship in there, and all the scholarship I mention is peer reviewed. But I never would say this article is peer reviewed. Of course, it's peer reviewed. So I don't understand why. I don't understand what that is. Maybe
it seems to be a kind of a magical talisman for them because he got that on the Historicity of Jesus book peer reviewed, and so that magically makes it into like authoritative. And of course, you and I both know that's not how peer review works.
But if he thinks that a peer review thing is authoritative, then what does he do with the fact that almost all the peer-reviewed articles and book chapters and books about Galatians disagree with him on virtually everything he says about it?
Yeah, except and Betts maybe, but yeah.
No, Betts doesn't agree with him.
True, yeah.
He says he does, but he doesn't. He doesn't think. Hans Dieter Betts, of course he thought that Jesus' brother was James was Jesus' brother.
Yeah, is missing the point of Schrödinger. Schrödinger's not arguing that, but anyway, Schrödinger's arguing whether James was an apostle. The question of whether he was a brother is a separate question. That actually, there's been a trend in the scholarship in the last 10 years to agree with me that there's all baptized Christians were brothers of the Lord, which complicates that problem. But that's not the Schrödinger debate. Schrödinger's debate is whether the James that's mentioned in Galatians 1:19, whether Paul is accepting him from the apostles or including him with the apostles. It's a really important grammatical argument. It has nothing to do with whether James is the brother of Jesus. So that's, again, suggests that they've not read the book. They don't know what my argument is. They don't know what Schrödinger's argument is. They don't know what they're talking about. And that's like reckless and irresponsible.
Yeah, and it seems like they speak rather definitively on it, and they even talk about the NIV translation. I believe Bart says that it was Gathercole that was heading up the committee for that, and he says that Gathercole specifically said to him, "No, I consider that James to be the brother of Jesus," like in Galatians 1:19.
Gathercole is heading the committee to what?
Oh, well, whoever was the head of the committee for the NIV translation.
Oh, but that wouldn't matter.
Maybe I got that wrong.
That wouldn't matter to this, though. Because the grammatical argument doesn't have anything to do with what kind of brother James is, so that's not relevant here. Like, it's only whether he was an apostle. So Gathercole would presumably, I'm assuming, I'm just speculating here, that Gathercole, because he has specific religious need for James, the brother of Jesus, to be an apostle. That's a dogmatic need that has nothing to do with history. That if he has the need for him to be an apostle, then he definitely wants Schrödinger to be false. So he has a bias against Schrödinger's conclusion. To defend his Christian dogma, he has to declare Schrödinger false, which is a emotion-based rejection, not an evidence-based rejection, right? Because I need Christian dogma to be true, so fuck Schrödinger. Like that's not a valid way to reason. But that only relates to whether James is an apostle, not whether he's the brother of Jesus. So I think it's important to keep that distinction. Now, if Ehrman didn't know that's even worse. But anyway, I just checked on the Historicity of Jesus. I looked for the word peer review. I use it only 3 times. Let me make sure I don't use it with a hyphen. Yeah, I don't ever use it. Yeah, I only use it. Well, I use it a few more than 3 times, but most cases in agreement with by rejecting things that didn't pass peer review. So would Ehrman, incidentally. But I never say Schrödinger was peer reviewed. I just cite Schrödinger, and in fact, I never cite anybody and say this was peer reviewed in OHJ. That never happens. So they're attributing to me a behavior that is not in my study. So that's lying. That's more lying about the study. And it's really slander because they're trying to portray me as some sort of nutcase. So it's an ad hominem through a lie about what's not in my book, basically.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I just wanted to check to make sure that was the case. But yeah, no, I never did that. So I never did the thing.
It's crazy how they're acting like mythicists are constantly being like, "Oh, is that peer reviewed? Is that peer reviewed? Is that peer reviewed?" When they should really, they seem to be maybe interacting with the online mythicist, I guess, community that maybe overly emphasizes it instead of they're mixing it up. They're talking about you while referencing other people. It seems,
and they're forgetting that they were the ones who started this, right? Like they're forgetting that. And that's the gaslighting aspect of this, is rewriting history so that it makes us look ridiculous when it should make them look ridiculous because they're the ones who were doing that. Now, I actually agree with that. Like back in the day when they were saying, and like I said, mythicism has never passed peer review. So why are we talking about it? Like that was my position. And that's true, right? Like you really should be able to get a theory through peer review in the field. Now I agree, this particular field is so compromised and so corrupt that it's possible that you get gate kept, right? And there's I'm not the only one who's complained about this, but I still think you should be able to do it. Even if you have to venue shop, you should be able to get someone who's going to do it and be unbiased in their peer review and publish it, as happened to me and Latester. So we both have done this. And so I do think that was important. I think it was important that we get, and I also sifted out between the bogus versions of mythicism and the defensible version, because Only one version of mythicism has survived peer review and survived it twice, and that's the Doherty model. And there's a reason why that matters. That matters because the Atwill model is bullshit, the Murdoch model is bullshit, the astrology model, the Buddhism model, like there's all these other models that are just dumb, that don't hold up, and wouldn't survive peer review for a reason, not because of bias. And that matters. That's important. So that's why they should be focusing on the peer-reviewed version of mythicism, not the amateur version. And I think Ehrman is probably doing that. O'Neill, I think, conflates them a lot. Like you said, I think he's kind of in his head, he's got it all jumbled up. But it matters to keep them apart, because I am not Atwill, I am not Murdoch. Lataster and my arguments are not Murdoch's arguments, not Atwill's arguments, and so on. That matters. It's important. And also, like, when things like, if people are going to make a complex grammatical argument about Galatians, it better have passed peer review. Otherwise, why should I pay any attention to it? Why would Ehrman, like he said himself, he wrote this whole book, all his citations are peer reviewed. Now, why? Why are all his citations peer reviewed? Well, it's because he only trusts peer reviewed literature, right? So he agrees with me, right? We should only be looking at peer reviewed literature on this stuff. Trudinger is peer reviewed. He went through the proper process. He even went through double review because we have Howard's critique, also passed peer review. And I have wrote a whole article about this called Galatians 1:19. Search for it on my blog, where I show you, like, as a layperson, how you can adjudicate these debates without being an expert. Because Trudinger and Howard both do this correctly in such a way that you can they have all their cards on the table. Neither of them is lying. Neither of them is making stuff up. Neither of them is omitting things, so that you can actually compare the logic of their two positions and see who's right yourself, like, without being an expert, because you're trusting both of them to be experts, and they are, and they write expert things. So you can evaluate that. And that's the value of peer review, is that it made sure that their arguments are of that quality that you can do this, right? That's why internet is, like, most of it is bullshit. You can't rely on it. Peer review matters. Even when it's a compromised, unreliable peer review system, it's better than just I get to publish on the internet or publish a book by myself or whatever. Ehrman knows this. He knows this because that's why all his citations are peer reviewed, because he knows exactly everything I just said to you right now is true. So that's why peer review matters. Even when it's shitty peer review, it matters. And that's why it matters that Trudinger passed peer review. I guarantee you that Ehrman would completely dismiss Trudinger if he never passed peer review, if his argument was just some self-published or internet complaint about the grammar. He says, well, I mean, he should be able to get that through peer review if that was actually a legitimate argument. And it is. And so not only is it so legitimate that it convinced multiple commentators on Galatians and multiple translation committees of the Bible. So obviously it met massive amounts of peer review, not just his peer reviewers. He would have had two for the journal article, but also Howard. Even Howard's a critic. Howard is still validating all the things that matter, and Trudinger, he confirms that it's true. And the commentators that's another set of peer review. So it's massively peer reviewed. Why would you reject it? So you need to have a good reason to reject all of that. And the only way to do that is to go and look at the actual argument and evidence and come to your own expert opinion about it. So you can't, so this whole gaslighting about peer review doesn't matter is bullshit. And I think it's offensive and unprofessional of Ehrman to actually make this argument that peer review doesn't matter. It absolutely matters. But it does, there are aspects of peer review that you can critique. And there are tons of experts who've critiqued and criticized the peer review system. That's also true. But that doesn't affect the fact that there's a difference between stuff that passes and stuff that doesn't. And even Obsolete Paradigm passed when you think that peer review is only about fact checking and not about, like, bias, right? Mm-hmm. So anyway, that's my rant about that again.
Yeah, you're good. We've got maybe 50 seconds left here in this particular section, and then we'll move to signing off. But yeah.
Okay.
So I just wondered about the peer review thing. So why don't scholars write peer-reviewed books arguing that Jesus existed?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. It's like, I mean, look, I don't want to sound offensive to anybody, because I think every hypothesis has to be considered. When you're doing history, everything has to be considered as a possibility. But there are some things that experts agree on so widely that they don't write books on people who argue something else. I mean, for example, there are thousands of professional astronomers in the country. No, I won't do astronomers. I'll do geologists. Thousands of geologists in the country And none of them is going to spend his time or her time writing a long peer-reviewed book to prove that the Earth is not 6,000 years old.
Okay, so I stopped right there because
I'm not
he
entirely
just
sure that's true, but even if it is true, it's disingenuous. But yeah.
right. Yeah, so I was just going to explain. I stopped right there because he goes on about a 5-minute rant about how there's no point in writing a book about the historicity of Jesus because it's so widely accepted that there's just no point in writing about it because it's a lot like refuting creationism. Which I would say that there are plenty of scientists. I know of plenty of scientists that have written books, both pop level and peer-reviewed papers and monographs that directly refute a lot of the creationist talking points. And so those are things that actually happen.
I just Googled peer-reviewed books criticizing creationism, and there's a massive list. Okay, so fucker, the motherfucker. Yeah, they fucking do that. But also, it's a false analogy, and I think like because this is not. See, it's a sneak ad hominem, right? It's like mythicism is like 6,000-year-old young Earth creationism. It is not. It is not like that, because importantly, young Earth creationism has never passed peer review, right? Now, here, imagine the situation. Imagine the situation is that we had 2 peer-reviewed scientific, like a prestigious journal, let's say Royal Society journals or whatever of biology, and we have massive peer-reviewed articles, 2 independent peer-reviewed articles proving young Earth creationism. They pass peer review. They're now like the mainstream thing, and that's the status of the field. There's all the latest studies, multiple independent corroborating studies confirm young Earth creationism, and no one can produce a rebuttal through peer review in the field of biology or whatever. Now, what would be the reaction there, right? Like you would say, like, what the hell's going on? Like, why can't you do this? Can't you do this? Shouldn't you do this? Isn't it morally obligatory for biologists to do this? Why can't they do it? Is it because they can't pass peer review? Is it because they really don't have the arguments? I think it's a waste of time. Why bother? The field is now, the consensus now is young Earth creationism. Why should I? Well, fuck that. I should just go on believing old Earth creationism. Like, what is the things here? So, but that's, of course, it's, the analogy to creationism is wrong. This is actually a very like close call. It's not a obvious long call like that. Like young Earth creationism is so wildly, it's like flat earthism. It's like wildly false. Yeah, mythicism is actually plausible. It's actually in the realm of plausibility. And I've got a list of historians, over 40 historians who agree, since 2014, who agree that that mythicism is plausible. It's not like young Earth creationism. It's not like flat earthism. And so it matters if all the latest studies, and that's the case, there have only been 2 peer-reviewed monographs specifically on historicity of Jesus in 100 years. And both of them find for doubt. So right now, the state of the field is that all the peer-reviewed literature on the historicity of Jesus finds for doubt, all of it. There's multiple independent studies, and there's no countermanding study. That's a scandal for the field. It's a fucking scandal. So you better put out a peer-reviewed rebuttal that actually addresses the actual arguments in those books. Not bullshit that like lies about what's in the books and rebuts straw man arguments of things that aren't in there. That which is all we've gotten. Not that. No, like a real proper review of the evidence to establish a countermanding study to say that, okay, actually, it is disputable whether Jesus existed or not, other than it's established that he didn't. It's disputable. And then ideally, you want to say, like, can we refute these things? So we'd have multiple corroborated studies establishing historicity against the challenge to the consensus. And then that would become that would establish the consensus against the assault on the consensus. So we have a valid challenge to the consensus. It's not a invalid, it's not pseudo, it's real. It's in a real peer-reviewed, meets the actual standards of the field. 2 challenges now. So can you meet the challenge? And if you cannot meet the challenge, you have not met the challenge. And that's the story of you, right? So like historicity is dead. Like there's no valid consensus for favoring historicity if it cannot defeat these studies. If it's just going to blithely ignore the studies and just use the circular argument, well, everybody thinks they're bullshit, they've not read it, but whatever, we're just going to go with that. It's like, well, then you can never overthrowing a consensus, because a consensus is just dogma then, right? Like the consensus can never be refuted if you're just going to reject all refutations out of hand. It's like, we're not going to read them. We're just going to keep citing the consensus against challenges of the consensus. Therefore, we'll never change the consensus. It can't ever change. No matter how false the consensus is, it can never change. And that's the system that Ehrman is defending. He's defending a dogmatism, a system that protects dogma, not a system that the consensus is worth citing. Because if the consensus is just repeating an unrehearsed dogma, if it's just a dogma, they're not reacting to any evidence-based challenges, they're not overcoming any challenges, they're ignoring all the challenges, just repeating the dogma, then the consensus is not citable. It's not evidence anymore. It's worthless. For the consensus to be valuable, it has to be able to survive critique. And that means it has to actually confront critique. If it won't confront critique, it's not surviving critique. And that's just the end of it. And so this is the big scandal, I think. And that's one thing I talk about a lot in Obsolete Paradigm, is that the field is reacting like dogmatists, not like scholars. And so the consensus in the field is not citable anymore because it's not based on evidence or reasoning or standards. It's just based solely on feelings, prestige, and dogma, and that's it. And so, yeah, that matters. So I think, like, for Ehrman to think that, well, we can just ignore these studies, we don't have to publish countermanding studies, illustrates exactly the fraudulent nature of the consensus in this field and why you can't trust it.
Yeah, so I was just going to point out, I've actually got this really thick book right here called The Rocks Were There, and it's all about refuting creationism. Just, in case Ehrman needs an FYI on that. Written by two scientists, by the way, and with some input from geologists too. So letting everybody know, we are taking super chat questions, but be warned, I do need to go here in just a second. We do have South Galician who says, when can we have a Berman v. Carrier debate? Jacob seems to me to be the best historicity defender at the moment. Yeah. I don't know. I debated Berman on it, and he did not have a good argument, in my opinion. But I don't know.
I'm throwing another link in where I write about when a consensus is valid or not, because I saw some chatter in the comments about when do we trust a consensus, that's a valid question, and I threw that in where I've written a whole article about that. So for people who are interested in that, find that link there.
Yeah. And as much as I would like to host a debate, Carrier, about this, I don't think that Berman will talk to me, for one, and for two, he's kind of not welcome here on the channel, just because he's been real flip-floppy, and like he's gone back and forth, and now he's supporting a racist kind of thing. So it's like,
Also, I have to say, I only do live debates very expensively now. So if someone wants to foot some serious bill, I'll do that. But what I would do much cheaper is a written debate. And I would prefer to do it with someone who actually has a PhD in the field, because I'm kind of tired of debating of amateurs. And there's a particular reason, because I'm sick of it, because I've seen how it goes every time. So they don't know what they're talking about, really. But they're overconfident. Dunning-Kruger isn't really in effect, but it kind of feels like that. And so I feel like that's unproductive. If I were to do a written debate, I would very much like it to be with someone who's an actual expert in the field who actually knows what they're talking about. And I think I would prefer a written debate, and I would do that in some cases for free, depending on who the opponent is. But for live debates, that's just all entertainment. I charge entertainment fees for that. That's expensive. But written debates, I'll do much more affordably.
Yeah. That seems to be all of the super chats. We did get a new member, Torsten Phil. Thank you so much for becoming a member here on the channel. Yeah. You're awesome. But yeah, that's going to be it tonight. I've got to get off here and call my son, but Rick, it's been fabulous having you on, to discuss this. I'm so sorry that we didn't get through all the clips, but there was a lot to unpack.
Yeah. And I have to say, for people who wanted that Brother of the Lord section, I'm pretty sure, I didn't watch all of it, but I'm pretty sure the Obsolete Paradigm chapter on the Brothers of the Lord thing refutes every fucking thing O'Neill or Ehrman has ever or will ever say on that question. So the new book is really the rebuttal already.
Yeah, I mean, so what I got out of that section was essentially they were clinging on to old scholarship and are
Yeah.
not actually.
Ironically. I
Yeah.
don't know. 1975. Can't trust that anymore.
But they definitely make it out to be like it's a very minority position, and that
Yeah.
everybody in the field agrees that they like that brother of the Lord is
Yeah.
not talking about Christians, which is
Right.
something you specifically handle in Obsolete Paradigm.
Yeah, which confuses two different things. So the question of whether James is a biological brother of Jesus is a different question from whether all Christians who are baptized thought of themselves as brothers of the Lord. They're related; these relate to each other, but you can't conflate them. And I do feel like Ehrman and O'Neill conflate them. They think these are the same thing, but they're not. You have to resolve them separately. On the question of whether all Christians thought they were baptized, all baptized Christians thought they were brothers of the Lord, that is mainstream consensus now. So like there's been 10 studies. All the studies on this come to that conclusion. I cite them all in Obsolete Paradigm. That is the mainstream consensus of the field. All experts agree. There's no argument there, really. None that exists anyway, not yet anyway. Now, for the question of whether James himself is biological brother or a cultic brother, separate question. Yeah, I am a lone wolf, not a lone wolf. There are a few of us. But I think that's kind of the obvious conclusion of the other finding, right? So, and to really see that, you have to actually read the argument and follow the argument. You can't just dismiss it and say like, well, that's ridiculous. Circularly, we're going to cite the consensus against a challenge to the consensus without consulting the actual challenge and figuring out if it's a valid challenge or not, right? That's the sort of circularity that's going on here, that's avoiding the conclusion. So that would be valid to say, like, not most scholars don't agree with me on that final conclusion, but there's a reason they don't agree with me and it's not valid.
Right. But anyways, I really appreciate you coming on. Like I said, again, everybody, I have links in the description for y'all. Definitely go and check out Carrier's website as well as the articles that are linked. We have the Brothers of the Lord thing that's linked, as well as the Ehrman historicity recap that's down there in the description. Also down there are links to get the Jesus from Outer Space, and I will have links for Obsolete Paradigm down there as well. So definitely get all of those resources. They're great resources, even with the even if you're not a mythicist, having those resources, because it's mythicism is like a conglomerate of like all of these positions. It's just there's one little bit of it that is mythicist. The rest of it is kind of like just biblical scholarship in general.
Yeah, right.
So, but anyways, thank you so much, Rick, for joining me tonight. I really appreciate you for taking your time out of your night to do this. And I guess I'll just talk to you later.
Yeah, you bet.
All right. Bye, heathens. I hope you will stand up, use your voice, and all that kind of good shit. Later.